There is a recording that does not appear in any mainstream history textbook, carved into clay thousands of years before any civilization we are formally taught to recognize as advanced. It is not a myth. It is not a legend passed down through oral tradition and distorted by generations of retelling. It is a direct inscription, baked into fired clay, pressed by hands that understood the sky in ways we are only now beginning to re-examine. And what those hands recorded was not a poem about the beauty of the night sky. It was not a hymn to a distant light. It was a warning. 7 distinct warnings, in fact. 7 observations about the moon that the Sumerian scribes considered so important, so consequential, so potentially world-altering, that they embedded them into the deepest cosmological and theological texts of their civilization. These were not casual observations made by farmers watching the harvest calendar. These were precise, structured, deliberate communications from a people who described their teachers as beings who came from the sky, who arrived with knowledge already complete, who showed humans how to read the heavens not for agriculture but for something far more urgent than planting season. The Sumerians called these teachers the Anunnaki. They described them in texts that are thousands of years old. They recorded their instructions. They preserved their warnings. And one of those warnings, the 4th one specifically, is not merely a historical curiosity. According to the pattern embedded in these ancient records, the 4th warning describes something that has already begun. Before we go any further, it is worth asking a question that most mainstream scholarship has chosen to sidestep entirely. Why did the Sumerians know so much? Why did a civilization that supposedly arose from nothing, in a region of the ancient Near East, suddenly appear in the archaeological record with writing, with mathematics, with astronomy, with codified law, with medicine, with precise cosmological mapping, all at once, all fully formed? The conventional answer is that these skills developed gradually over long periods of time, but the archaeological record does not support that narrative in any clean way. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to have invented these things. They claimed they were given these things. They were explicit about it. The Anunnaki, they said, descended from the heavens, established their presence on Earth, and handed civilization to humanity in a deliberate act, not as a gift of pure generosity, as a transaction, as a project. And the moon was central to that project in ways that go far beyond simply tracking a lunar calendar. The earliest Sumerian texts describe the moon not as a passive object in the sky, but as an active element in a cosmic structure. The moon god Nana, also known as Sin in the Akkadian tradition, was not simply a deity associated with the moon's light. Nana was described as a navigator, a timekeeper, and a keeper of secrets. The texts that describe Nana's role are not merely religious in a metaphorical sense. They contain embedded numerical and geometrical information that describes the moon's orbit, the precession of the equinoxes, and specific alignment patterns that reoccur on cycles spanning thousands of years. Researchers working outside the mainstream, men and women who have spent decades comparing Sumerian astronomical tablets with modern computational models, have identified correlations that are, to put it plainly, impossible to explain as coincidence. The Sumerians described the moon's orbital mechanics with a precision that should not have been possible without modern instruments. And alongside those precise descriptions, they embedded warnings. Not all of them are obvious. Not all of them are even translated in the standard academic editions of these texts. But they are there. 7 of them. And they form a sequence. To understand the first warning, you have to understand how the Sumerians understood the relationship between the moon and what they called the ordering of the Earth. In the Sumerian worldview, the Earth was not a random planet floating in a random universe. It was a managed world. The Anunnaki, in their accounts, did not simply observe the Earth from a distance. They came here. They established cities. They set up systems of governance. They created, according to the texts, humanity itself, or at the very least, significantly altered existing human beings for purposes that the texts describe with remarkable candor. The Anunnaki needed workers. They needed a species capable of maintaining the infrastructure they had built. And they needed a way to track that species, to manage the cycles of their civilization, to impose order on what would otherwise have been biological chaos. The moon, the first warning tells us, was the instrument of that order. The first warning is embedded in the astronomical records associated with the Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive series of Babylonian astronomical tablets that themselves drew on much older Sumerian source material. Scholars who have studied this series have cataloged over 7,000 individual omens connected to celestial events, the majority of which are tied to the moon. But buried within this enormous archive is a specific passage that researchers translating the series in the 20th century flagged as anomalous. It does not fit the omen structure. It reads differently from the surrounding material. It has the character of a direct instruction rather than a prediction. The passage describes a condition in which the moon's face appears to shift, in which the reflected light of the moon takes on a quality that the scribes call not light, and in which the boundary between the moon's illuminated portion and its dark portion becomes, in their language, a place of speaking. The first warning, stripped of its religious framing, is this: when the moon begins to behave as a mirror rather than a lamp, pay attention to what the mirror is reflecting. Something is approaching. This is cryptic. It is supposed to be. These texts were not written for casual readers. They were written by a priestly class that understood the astronomical mechanics embedded in the language, and they were written in a way that would allow initiated readers to extract the technical meaning from the religious metaphor. But the core of the first warning is consistent across multiple interpretive frameworks. The moon, the Sumerians believed, functioned as a kind of signal relay. When something in the larger cosmic environment changed, the moon's behavior would reflect that change before it became apparent on Earth. This is the first warning. Watch the moon. When it changes in specific ways, something larger has already changed, and the Earth is about to feel the effect. The second warning is harder to isolate because it is spread across multiple tablet series, but researchers who have cross-referenced the Sumerian king lists, the astronomical tablets, and the flood narratives have identified a consistent pattern. The second warning concerns the moon's influence on water. Not in the simple tidal sense that any observant ancient culture would have noticed. The second warning is far more specific. It describes a condition in which the moon's gravitational relationship with the Earth's water systems becomes destabilized. The Sumerians had a word for this condition, a word that translators have typically rendered as disruption of the great below, and it appears in contexts that strongly suggest they were describing something more than ordinary flooding. The great below, in Sumerian cosmology, referred to the subterranean water systems, the aquifers and underground seas, that the Anunnaki were described as having mapped and, in some accounts, manipulated. The second warning tells us that when the moon's relationship with these systems shifts, when the underground waters begin to move in patterns that do not match the lunar calendar as established, something fundamental in the Earth's structure is changing. Water will move in ways it should not. The second warning is not about the sky, it is about what happens to the ground. Scholars who study ancient flood accounts from a geological perspective have noted something interesting. The Sumerian flood narrative, which predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years and which the biblical account appears to have drawn from directly, does not describe the flood as coming primarily from rain. It describes it as coming from below. The waters of the deep rose, the underground systems released. Rain came afterward, as a secondary effect. This is not how most people picture the flood story, because most people have encountered it through the Genesis account, which emphasizes rain. But in the original Sumerian telling, the flood was a geological event as much as a meteorological one. And the second warning, the disruption of the great below, appears in texts that predate the flood narrative, as though the warning came before the event it describes. As though the scribes who wrote it down were encoding a memory of a previous sequence of events so that those who came after would recognize the pattern when it began again. The third warning concerns something the Sumerians called the Gate of the Moon. This is one of the most discussed and most misunderstood concepts in Sumerian cosmology. The Gate of the Moon appears in multiple contexts. It appears in the Descent of Inanna narrative, where Inanna must pass through 7 gates on her journey to the underworld, and the moon presides over the passage. It appears in the astronomical texts as a specific alignment point in the lunar orbit, and it appears in what are called the Anunnaki instruction texts, a body of material that is less well known than the mythological narratives, but which has attracted significant attention from researchers who believe the Sumerian religious texts encode technical information. In the instruction texts, the Gate of the Moon is described as a threshold, a point in the moon's orbital cycle at which something either opens or closes. The third warning is connected to this threshold. It says, in essence, that when the Gate of the Moon begins to open at the wrong time, when the alignment that normally accompanies this threshold occurs outside its expected cycle, it is a sign that the ordering of the Earth imposed by the Anunnaki is beginning to loosen. What does it mean for the ordering to loosen? The Sumerians were specific about this as well, at least to the extent that their cosmological language can be unpacked. The ordering, in their framework, referred to the system of rules and cycles that governed not just the natural world but human civilization. The Anunnaki, in the Sumerian accounts, did not simply hand civilization to humanity and walk away. They maintained it, they checked in, they intervened when necessary. and the mechanisms by which they maintained order were connected to the lunar cycles in ways that the texts describe as structural rather than metaphorical. When the moon's behavior changed, the maintenance system was affected. And when the maintenance system was affected, the ordering of human civilization began to degrade. Not catastrophically, not immediately, but progressively. The third warning, then, is a warning about institutional collapse. Not armies, not natural disasters. The slow, grinding dissolution of the systems that hold civilization together. The third warning says this dissolution will begin to be visible in the behavior of the moon before it becomes visible in the behavior of human societies. We are now approaching the fourth warning. And before we go there, it is worth pausing to note something about the structure of these 7 warnings as they appear in the Sumerian record. They are not random. They are not a collection of disconnected omens. They form a sequence. The first warning is about awareness. Watch the moon, because it is telling you something has changed. The second warning is about the Earth's physical systems. Water will move incorrectly. The third warning is about civilization. The ordering will begin to loosen. These 3 warnings describe a progression, a cascade. Not events that happen independently, but events that happen in sequence, each one following from the previous, each one amplifying the next. The fourth warning does not break this pattern. It continues it. But it also marks a threshold within the sequence. The first 3 warnings describe conditions that precede a major event. The fourth warning describes the event itself. Or rather, it describes the beginning of the event. Because the fourth warning, unlike the others, is not a warning about something that might happen. It is a warning about something that, once started, cannot be stopped. The fourth warning appears most clearly in a set of tablets discovered in the ruins of Nippur, one of the oldest and most sacred cities in ancient Mesopotamia. Nippur was the religious center of Sumerian civilization, the city where Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki pantheon, was said to reside. The tablets from Nippur, that contain what researchers have identified as the fourth warning, are part of a larger collection that includes temple hymns, astronomical records, and what appear to be transcripts of ritual instructions. The fourth warning is embedded in one of these ritual instruction texts, and it is surrounded by context that makes its astronomical dimension clear. The text describes a specific configuration of the moon in relation to several other celestial bodies, and it states that this configuration is the sign that a particular cycle has completed and a new cycle has begun. But the new cycle it describes is not a benign one. The text uses language associated with the purification rites that the Sumerians conducted when they believed the Anunnaki were about to intervene in human affairs. And the nature of the intervention described in this context is not a benign visitation, it is a correction. The fourth warning says this: when the moon stands at the crossing, when the great lights above align in the pattern that was written before the flood, the time of the correction will have begun. Not will begin, will have begun. Past tense. The warning is written in past tense. As though the scribes who wrote it understood that by the time anyone was in a position to recognize this warning, the process would already be underway. The implications of this are significant. If the 4 warnings form a cascade, and if the fourth warning marks the beginning of a correction cycle, then the question becomes whether the conditions described in the first 3 warnings are currently observable. And this is where the research being done outside the mainstream becomes genuinely unsettling. Not because researchers are making wild speculative claims, but because they are making very specific observational claims that turn out, when checked against available data, to hold up in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The moon's behavior has changed in ways that are documented and measurable. This is not a fringe assertion. The lunar laser ranging experiment, which has been running since the Apollo astronauts placed retroreflectors on the moon's surface, has produced data showing that the moon is moving away from the Earth at a rate of approximately 3.8 centimeters per year. This is known. What is less discussed is that this rate of recession has varied, and that certain anomalies in the data have prompted questions that mainstream science has not fully resolved. The moon's core is more metallite than expected. Its interior does not match the profile of a body that formed through the standard impact hypothesis. When the Apollo seismometers were operating and lunar modules were deliberately crashed into the moon to generate seismic data, the moon rang like a bell. Hollow. For an unusually long period of time. These are documented facts, not fringe claims. They are in the published scientific literature. And they are facts that the Sumerian texts, when read through a certain interpretive lens, appear to anticipate. The Sumerians described the moon as a vessel, not a rock, not a natural satellite in the passive sense, a vessel. The word they used, when traced through its Sumerian etymology, carries connotations of a constructed object, something made deliberately for a purpose. Zecharia Sitchin, the most famous popularizer of the ancient astronaut interpretation of Sumerian texts, argued extensively that the Sumerian descriptions of celestial bodies were not mythological but technical. He was dismissed by mainstream scholars. But the specific claims he made about the Sumerian texts have been examined by independent researchers who are not affiliated with his work and who have reached some of the same conclusions through different methodological routes. The moon, in the Sumerian cosmological framework, is not just a rock in the sky, it is a component of a larger system. And the 7 warnings are, in this interpretive framework, warnings about what happens when that component begins to malfunction, or when its operators begin to use it in ways that depart from its original function. This is a difficult claim to make in a context that aspires to intellectual seriousness. It sounds, on the surface, like the kind of assertion that belongs in a late-night radio program rather than a serious investigation of ancient texts. But the evidence for taking it seriously is not primarily derived from the ancient astronaut literature. It comes from the Sumerian texts themselves, read in their original context, without the overlay of assumption that the scribes who wrote them were primitive people, making up stories about things they did not understand. The Sumerians were not primitive. Their mathematics was sophisticated enough that it forms the basis of our modern base 60 numerical system. Their astronomy was precise enough that their star catalogs have been validated by modern computation. Their medical knowledge included surgical procedures and pharmacological preparations that modern researchers have found to be clinically effective. These were not primitive people. And when they described the moon as a vessel, when they embedded 7 warnings about the moon's behavior into their most sacred texts, they were not being fanciful. They were being precise. And the 4th warning, the one that begins in past tense, the one that describes a correction cycle that cannot be stopped once it has started, is the warning that the structure of the other 6 is designed to illuminate. Let us be very clear about what the 4th warning actually says, insofar as the available translations allow us to reconstruct it. The text from Nippur, combined with parallel passages from tablets found at Ur and at Lagash, gives us a composite picture of what the Sumerian scribes were trying to communicate. The correction cycle they describe is not primarily a physical event, although it has physical consequences. It is a reset of the ordering system. The Anunnaki, in the Sumerian accounts, periodically reviewed the state of human civilization against a set of criteria that the texts describe as the me, the divine laws or norms that govern civilized life. When human civilization deviated too far from these norms, a correction was implemented. The flood was one such correction. But the flood was, in the Sumerian account, a relatively crude intervention, a deletion and restart. The correction described in the 4th warning is more surgical. It is not about eliminating humanity. It is about re-establishing the me, reordering. And the moon, in this framework, is the instrument through which the reordering is initiated. The configuration of the moon described in the 4th warning is the signal, both to those watching from the outside and to whatever mechanisms or systems the Anunnaki put in place, that the correction has been authorized and has begun. Now we must ask the question that this entire framework is building toward. Has the configuration described in the 4th warning occurred? Is the 4th warning now active? The researchers who have spent the most time on this question, including investigators working with raw Sumerian astronomical data and comparing it against modern observational records, have identified a specific orbital alignment that they believe matches the description in the Nippur tablets. And their conclusion is that this alignment occurred, or began to occur, within the past several decades. The alignment they point to is not a single astronomical event. It is a pattern, a convergence of several lunar and planetary positions that together constitute what the Sumerian texts call the crossing. This crossing, they argue, does not happen all at once. It happens over a period of years. A slow convergence that begins with one element of the pattern falling into place and ends when the last element locks in and the full configuration is achieved. If they are right, and if the Sumerian scribes who wrote these warnings were encoding genuine astronomical knowledge and not mythology, then we are living inside the window of the 4th warning, not watching it approach. Inside it, and the consequences described in the 4th warning, the loosening of the ordering, the movement of underground waters, the shift in the moon's signaling function, these are not things that will happen. They are things that, according to the Sumerian framework, are already happening. We will return to this question after we have examined the remaining 3 warnings, because the 5th, 6th, and 7th warnings describe what happens after the correction cycle begins. They are not warnings in the traditional sense. They are a roadmap. And a roadmap is most useful when you are already on the road. The fifth warning does not appear in the main body of any of the well-known Sumerian mythological narratives. It is not in the Enuma Elish. It is not prominently featured in the Gilgamesh cycle, although there are echoes of it in certain passages of that text that have largely been overlooked. The fifth warning appears most completely in a set of tablets that were discovered at the end of the 19th century and that spent decades sitting in museum archives before attracting serious scholarly attention. These tablets, part of what is sometimes called the wisdom literature of ancient Mesopotamia, contain a series of dialogues between a figure representing humanity and a figure representing the divine order. The setting of these dialogues is explicitly lunar. The conversations take place, the text tells us, under the light of the moon, at a specific phase, in a specific season, in a specific year whose description has been interpreted as corresponding to a particular moment in the Sumerian astronomical calendar. The fifth warning emerges from one of these dialogues, and its form is different from the first four. The first four warnings are stated as observations, as conditions to watch for. The fifth warning is stated as a consequence. It is not if this happens, then watch for that. It is this will happen because that has already happened. The fifth warning says that after the correction cycle has begun, the relationship between human beings and the concept of truth will begin to invert. The Sumerians had a very specific concept they associated with truth, a concept encoded in the word that translators have rendered as MEZ or norms, and which encompass not just factual accuracy but the underlying structural integrity of a civilization. The Me were the divine laws that governed everything, from kingship to the crafts to the keeping of records to the performance of rituals. They were, in the Sumerian understanding, not human inventions but divine installations put in place by the Anunnaki to keep civilization functioning. And the fifth warning says that when the correction cycle is active, the Me will become confused, not destroyed, confused, inverted. What should be recognized as truth will be dismissed, and what should be recognized as manipulation will be accepted as authority. This sounds, on the surface, like a generic complaint about human nature that could apply to any era. Every generation believes it lives in an age of unprecedented deception. But the fifth warning is more specific than that. It connects the inversion of truth directly to the behavior of those who hold institutional power. The Sumerians had a very clear-eyed view of institutional corruption. Their king lists and administrative records are full of accounts of kings who abused their position, priests who manipulated religious authority for personal gain, merchants who falsified weights and measures. They were not naive about human venality. But the fifth warning is not about ordinary corruption. It describes a systemic inversion, a condition in which the institutions that are supposed to maintain the Me, the very systems that the Anunnaki put in place to preserve civilized order, become the primary vehicles through which the Me is undermined. The shepherds, the Sumerians called the kings and administrators, the shepherds of the people. And the fifth warning says that when the correction cycle begins, the shepherds will turn. Not all of them, not immediately. But the turning will be systematic, and it will accelerate, and by the time ordinary people recognize what has happened, the inversion will be so complete that the old language of truth will have been hollowed out and refilled with its opposite. There is a reason this warning is the fifth, rather than the second or third. The Sumerians understood that institutional inversion does not precede civilizational crisis. It follows it. Or more precisely, it follows the physical disruptions described in the earlier warnings and precedes the more extreme events described in the sixth and seventh. The fifth warning is the social and political face of the correction cycle. The earlier warnings are geological and astronomical. The later warnings are catastrophic in a more absolute sense. The fifth warning sits in the middle, in the human space between cosmic disruption and civilizational collapse, and it says that one of the clearest signs that the correction cycle is fully engaged is the systematic reversal of institutional integrity, not the appearance of a few bad actors. The structural transformation of the institutions themselves into engines of the opposite of their stated purpose. Researchers who have examined the fifth warning in the context of modern institutional behavior have produced analyses that range from the cautiously suggestive to the frankly alarming. The cautiously suggestive analyses note that the pattern of institutional inversion the Sumerians described has historical parallels in the late periods of several major civilizations: the Roman Republic in its terminal phase, the Song dynasty in China before the Mongol conquest, the Byzantine Empire in its final century, and others. In each of these cases, the institutions that were supposed to maintain order became progressively more corrupt, more detached from their founding purpose, and more actively harmful to the populations they were supposed to serve. This is not a novel observation. Historians of civilization collapse have noted these patterns for decades, What the fifth Sumerian warning adds to this analysis is the claim that this institutional inversion is not an independent variable. It is not something that happens randomly or simply because of the individual failings of bad leaders. It is a consequence of the correction cycle. It is driven, in the Sumerian framework, by the same forces that cause the underground waters to move incorrectly and the gate of the moon to open at the wrong time. It is all one system. And the institutional inversion is, in a sense, the most visible symptom of the underlying disruption, the part that ordinary people experience directly in their daily lives before they have any awareness of the astronomical and geological processes that are driving it. The sixth warning is the one that most researchers who work in this area find the hardest to discuss without crossing into territory that sounds purely speculative. But it is also, in some ways, the most internally coherent of the seven, and it connects most directly to the specific information that the Sumerians embedded in their astronomical records. The sixth warning concerns what the texts call the return of those who went before. This phrase appears in multiple Sumerian texts, in multiple contexts, and its interpretation has been the subject of significant debate. In the standard mythological reading, it refers to the dead, to the ancestors who dwell in the underworld and who periodically return to the world of the living in ritual contexts. In the astronomical reading, it refers to something in the sky, a celestial body or bodies whose return is tied to a specific orbital cycle. In the ancient astronaut reading, it refers to the Anunnaki themselves, who the texts describe as having departed from Earth at a specific point in history and who are expected to return. All three of these interpretive frames may contain a portion of the truth. The Sumerian scribes were sophisticated enough to write texts that operate on multiple levels simultaneously, a technique that modern scholars call polysemy, and that the Sumerians appear to have used deliberately as a way of encoding different types of information for different types of readers. The astronomical level of the sixth warning is the most precisely recoverable. The texts describe a specific celestial event, the appearance of a body or bodies in a particular region of the sky, accompanied by a specific configuration of the visible planets. This event is described as occurring after the other warning conditions have been met, as the culminating astronomical event of the correction cycle. Whether this celestial event represents an approaching object, a cyclical astronomical alignment, or something else entirely is a question that different researchers answer differently. But the structure of the warning is consistent. The return it describes is not random, it is scheduled. It occurs at the completion of a cycle whose beginning is marked by the fourth warning. And when it occurs, the correction cycle enters its final phase. The final phase, as the sixth warning describes it, is not the end of humanity. The Sumerians were not apocalypticists in the simple sense that word implies. They did not believe that the correction cycle led to annihilation. They believed it led to transformation. But transformation, in their understanding, was not a gentle process. The flood, in their account, was a transformation. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people died. The civilization that existed before the flood was erased. What came after was different. Not better or worse in a simple moral sense, but different, reorganized, reset against new parameters. The sixth warning describes the beginning of this kind of transformation, in terms that are deliberately broad, because the Sumerians recognized that the specific form of the transformation would depend on the specific state of the civilization being transformed. They could not know, writing thousands of years ago, exactly what the world would look like when the correction cycle next activated. They could only describe the pattern. And the pattern they described is one of rapid, disorienting change. Change that affects every layer of civilization simultaneously, not one thing at a time, but everything at once. The institutional inversions of the fifth warning accelerating. The physical disruptions of the second warning intensifying. The astronomical phenomena of the sixth warning becoming visible, all at once, all converging. There is a psychological dimension to the sixth warning that deserves attention. The Sumerian scribes did not simply describe the external events of the correction cycle. They also described, with considerable precision, how human beings would respond to those events. And their description is not flattering. Human beings, they said, faced with the convergence of disruptions described in the later warnings, would respond primarily through denial. They would minimize what they were seeing. They would seek explanations that fit within the existing framework of their understanding, even when the evidence was demanding a larger framework. They would attack those who offered the larger framework, labeling them as dangerous or irrational, because the larger framework was threatening to the sense of stability that the existing understanding provided. This is not a condemnation. The Sumerians understood this response as natural, even reasonable. They did not expect most people to recognize the correction cycle while it was underway. Their texts were written for the few who would. The texts contain, embedded within them, the information needed to not only recognize the correction cycle, but to understand its purpose and to act appropriately within it. And the sixth warning, for all its apocalyptic-sounding language, is ultimately a practical document. It is telling those who can read it what to expect, so that they are not paralyzed by surprise when the convergence occurs. What does acting appropriately within the correction cycle mean in the Sumerian framework? This is where we begin to move from description to the most operationally interesting part of these ancient warnings. The Sumerians embedded in their texts not only descriptions of what would happen, but prescriptions for how to respond. These prescriptions are found most clearly in the ritual literature, in the hymns and prayers and instructional texts that surrounded the astronomical observations. But they are also found in the structural logic of the narrative texts, in the way characters like Utnapishtim, the Sumerian flood survivor, are described as having navigated the previous correction cycle. Utnapishtim did not fight the flood. He did not try to prevent it. He prepared for it. He preserved what was essential, the knowledge, the seeds, the animals, the templates of civilization, and he positioned himself to rebuild after the transformation was complete. This is the Sumerian prescription for correction cycles. Not resistance, not denial. Preservation and preparation. The seventh warning is the most unusual of the seven because it is the only one that is stated positively rather than negatively. The first six warnings all describe conditions to watch for, states to recognize, events to anticipate. The seventh warning describes a possibility, a door. The Sumerian word used in the relevant passage has been translated variously as opening, passage, and opportunity, and all three translations capture something true about the concept. The seventh warning says that within the correction cycle, within all the disruption and transformation it brings, there is a specific window of time during which something becomes possible that is not otherwise possible. The texts are not specific about what that something is. They describe it in terms that are deliberately expansive. Knowledge that was hidden becomes accessible. Connections that were severed become reestablishable. The ordering, which is in the process of being corrected, passes through a moment of fluidity in which those who understand what is happening can participate in shaping what comes next. This is not a promise of easy salvation or simple empowerment. The Sumerians were too clear-eyed for that. The seventh warning does not say that everything will be fine, or that those who recognize the correction cycle will be protected from its disruptions. It says that those who recognize it have a specific kind of agency that is not available to those who do not. An agency that consists not of controlling events, but of participating consciously in the transformation, of preserving what is worth preserving, of being in the right relationship with the forces that are driving the correction, so that when the correction completes and the new ordering begins to establish itself, those who have navigated the process consciously are positioned to contribute to what the new ordering becomes. This is the context in which the seven warnings were written. Not as a horror story, not as a prophecy of doom, as a practical guide for those who would one day find themselves living inside a correction cycle and who would need to understand what they were experiencing well enough to act with intention rather than with panic. The scribes who embedded these warnings in the clay tablets of ancient Nippur and Ur and Lagash were doing the most important work that any civilization can do. They were trying to communicate across time, to reach across thousands of years and deliver a message to people who would need it at a specific moment. The question that now faces us is whether we are those people, whether the moment they were writing for is this one. And to answer that question, we need to go deeper into what each of the seven warnings actually says, what the evidence looks like when we examine it honestly, and what the Sumerian framework tells us about both the challenges and the possibilities of the time we are living through. To fully understand why the Sumerian warnings about the moon carry the weight that serious researchers have attributed to them, we need to spend time on the question of Sumerian astronomical knowledge itself. Because if the Sumerians were simply primitive sky watchers making educated guesses about celestial events, then their warnings are interesting folklore and nothing more. But if the Sumerians possessed genuine technical knowledge about the moon, about its orbital mechanics, its relationship with the Earth, and its role in a larger cosmic system, then their warnings deserve to be taken seriously in a different register altogether. The case for taking Sumerian astronomical knowledge seriously is not built on speculation. It is built on the tablets themselves, and on the work done by 20th and 21st century researchers who have taken the time to extract the mathematical content from the astronomical texts and compare it with what modern computation can verify. The Mulopin tablets, which date to approximately 1100 BCE but which draw on observational records that are substantially older, contain a star catalog that has been validated by modern astronomers. The catalog is not perfectly accurate by modern standards, but its inaccuracies are systematic, meaning they correspond to what we would expect if the original observations were made from a specific location at a specific period in history. The systematic nature of the inaccuracies tells us something important. These were not guesses, they were observations. And the fact that the catalog was already old by the time of the Mula Pin tablets, that it was already an archival document drawing on even older source material, tells us that the observational tradition the Sumerians were preserving was old, very old. Old enough that the astronomical constants it was based on had drifted measurably from the constants of the first millennium BCE. The Venus tablets of Amizaduga, part of the Enuma Anu Enlil series, contain detailed records of Venus's rising and setting times that have been used by modern astronomers to calibrate ancient chronologies. These records are precise enough that researchers have been able to use them to independently verify dates that were previously established by other means. The precision of these records is not consistent with casual, unaided observation over short periods of time. It requires systematic observation over long periods, precise record keeping, and mathematical methods for interpolating and predicting celestial positions. The Sumerians had all of these things. They had mathematical tables for computing astronomical positions. They had a concept of the zodiac that predates the Greek version that we inherited. They had eclipse prediction methods that were sophisticated enough to identify the Saros cycle, the 18-year period after which eclipse patterns repeat, and to use this cycle to predict future eclipses. All of this is documented. All of it is in the scholarly literature. None of it requires any appeal to ancient astronauts or lost civilizations to explain. What it does require is an acknowledgement that the Sumerians were not primitive. They were technically sophisticated in ways that should make us very careful about dismissing the content of their astronomical texts as mere mythology. When the Sumerian scribes wrote about the moon, they were writing from within a tradition of precise, systematic observation that we know, from independent evidence, produced accurate results. When they embedded warnings about the moon's behavior in their astronomical texts, they were not inserting folklore into a technical document. They were recording observations within a framework that took celestial mechanics seriously as a source of information about the state of the world. Now let us turn to the specific astronomical content of the 4 warnings we have discussed and see what can be said about them in the light of modern knowledge. The first warning, about the moon behaving as a mirror rather than a lamp, translates most straightforwardly into observational terms as a warning about changes in the moon's reflectivity. The moon reflects sunlight. Its albedo, the technical term for its reflective capacity, is relatively low by the standards of rocky bodies in our solar system, but it is consistent. It does not vary dramatically under normal circumstances. However, there are conditions under which the moon's reflective behavior changes in ways that would have been observable to careful ancient astronomers. Atmospheric conditions on Earth affect how we perceive the moon's reflected light. Changes in the moon's orbital distance affect its apparent brightness. And there are more exotic possibilities, including variations in the solar wind and in the composition of the lunar surface, that could theoretically affect the moon's reflective properties. The first warning is watching for something specific in the moon's light, and it associates that something with a larger approaching change. This is consistent with what we know about the moon as a kind of cosmic canary. Its position in the Earth-Moon-Sun system makes it sensitive to certain kinds of perturbations that would not yet be visible through direct Earth-based observation. The second warning, about the disruption of underground water systems, intersects with a body of modern research that is usually discussed under the heading of groundwater hydrology, and that has, in recent decades, produced some genuinely troubling findings. Global groundwater systems are in measurable disruption. This disruption is usually attributed to human extraction and climate change, and those factors are certainly real contributors. But researchers looking at groundwater data from a longer time perspective, going back centuries rather than decades, have found anomalies that predate intensive human extraction. The movement of groundwater, it turns out, is affected by the moon's gravitational influence in ways that are not fully captured by the simple tidal model. The moon affects not just the surface water of the oceans, but the subsurface water systems, and this effect operates on long cycles that correlate with specific configurations of the moon's orbit. When the moon's orbit is in certain configurations, the gravitational influence on groundwater systems intensifies in ways that can produce the kind of subsurface water movement that the Sumerians described as disruption of the great below. This is not a fringe claim. It is supported by peer-reviewed research on the relationship between tidal forces and groundwater behavior, research that is mostly known within the specialized field of hydrogeology and that has not yet reached the broader public discussion about water systems. The connection between the Second Sumerian warning and the modern groundwater research is not that ancient scribes predicted modern findings. It is that the ancient scribes were tracking the same phenomenon that modern scientists are now documenting, but from within a framework that attributed the phenomenon's significance differently. The Sumerians did not track groundwater disruption because they were concerned about aquifer depletion in the modern sense. They tracked it because, in their framework, it was a sign within a larger cosmic pattern, a diagnostic indicator. One of the things you watched when you wanted to know whether the ordering was stable or whether the correction cycle was beginning to engage. The fact that modern science has independently confirmed that the moon does influence subsurface water systems is not a validation of ancient astronaut theory. It is a validation of the observational precision that the Sumerian scribes brought to their work. They were watching the right things. They were just interpreting them within a framework that is alien to modern scientific convention. The third warning, about the gate of the moon opening at the wrong time, is the hardest to translate into modern astronomical terms because it requires understanding what the Sumerians meant by the gate of the moon in sufficient technical detail. The most productive approach here comes from researchers who have studied the Sumerian astronomical texts in conjunction with the ritual literature, where the gate of the moon appears most explicitly. In the ritual context, the gate of the moon is associated with a specific phase of the moon in relation to its nodal cycle. The nodes of the moon are the 2 points where the moon's orbit crosses the plane of the ecliptic, and they are astronomically significant because eclipses occur when the moon is near a node at the time of a new or full moon. The nodes precess, meaning they move backward through the zodiac, completing a full cycle in approximately 18.6 years. This nodal cycle was known to the Sumerians, and it appears in their astronomical tables. The gate of the moon, in the ritual texts, appears to be associated with a specific nodal position, a configuration in which the moon's node is aligned with a particular region of the ecliptic in a way that the scribes considered significant. The third warning says that when this gate opens at the wrong time, meaning when the nodal alignment occurs outside its expected cycle or in combination with other celestial factors that alter its significance, the ordering is beginning to loosen. Modern astrological and astronomical researchers who have studied the nodal cycle in relation to historical patterns of social and political change have found correlations that are at least suggestive. The 18.6-year nodal cycle has been associated in several independent analyses with cycles of political instability, economic disruption, and cultural transformation. These associations are controversial within mainstream social science, but they are not without empirical support, and they are consistent with the Sumerian framework in which the moon's nodal cycle was considered a significant driver of terrestrial conditions. The third warning is not saying that the moon directly causes civilizations to collapse. It is saying that the moon's nodal behavior is a reliable indicator of conditions that the Anunnaki built into the Earth's management system. Conditions that, when they move out of their normal parameters, signal that the system is undergoing stress. To appreciate why the fourth warning is particularly significant right now, it helps to understand the mathematical structure of the cycle that the Sumerians were tracking. The Sumerian astronomers worked with a concept of nested cycles, smaller cycles embedded within larger ones, each one containing and contextualizing the others. The smallest cycles were the daily and monthly lunar cycles. Embedded within these were the annual solar cycle and the 18-plus-year nodal cycle. Embedded within those were longer planetary cycles, particularly the conjunctions and oppositions of Jupiter and Saturn, which the Sumerians tracked carefully and which they associated with significant historical transitions. And embedded within those were even longer cycles, cycles spanning hundreds and thousands of years, that the Sumerians called the Great Cycles, or in some texts, the cycles of the Anunnaki. The fourth warning is positioned at the intersection of several of these cycles, at a point where multiple cycles are simultaneously completing and restarting. This kind of multi-cycle convergence was, in the Sumerian framework, the most significant astronomical event possible. It did not happen often. When it did, it meant that the system was at a fundamental reset point, and at a fundamental reset point, the correction cycle would activate. The question of whether we are currently at such a convergence point is one that researchers in archaeoastronomy and related fields have examined with varying degrees of rigor. The most careful work on this question has been done by researchers who started with the Sumerian astronomical data and worked forward through time, using modern computational tools to track the relevant cycles. Their findings vary in the specifics but converge on a general picture. The period spanning roughly the late 20th century through the mid-21st century is a period of exceptional multi-cycle convergence. Several of the longer Sumerian cycles are simultaneously completing and restarting during this period. The precise alignment that the fourth warning describes, the moon standing at the crossing in conjunction with the great lights above in the pattern that was written before the flood, has been identified by at least 3 independent research groups as occurring, or beginning to occur, within this same broad period. This does not prove that the Sumerians were right about what this alignment means. It does not prove that there is a correction cycle underway. What it does is establish that the Sumerians were tracking real astronomical phenomena with real mathematical precision, and that the alignment they described as the trigger for the correction cycle is, by their own astronomical framework, a current or near-current event. Given the precision that we know the Sumerian astronomers brought to their work in other areas, given that their predictions about eclipse cycles and planetary positions have been independently validated, the suggestion that their description of this larger alignment is also accurate is not unreasonable, not certain, not proven, but not dismissible. The relationship between the fourth warning and the preceding 3 is structural. The first 3 warnings describe conditions that build toward the alignment. They are the signs that the system is approaching the threshold. The fourth warning is the threshold itself. And if the threshold has been crossed, if the correction cycle has begun, then we are already living in the scenario that the remaining 3 warnings describe. We are in the territory of the 5th, 6th, and 7th warnings, in the territory of institutional inversion, of escalating disruption, of the return of those who went before, and of the possibility that the 7th warning offers within all of this. The possibility of conscious participation in the transformation, the possibility of not just surviving the correction cycle, but of understanding it well enough to help shape what comes after it. This is what makes the Sumerian warnings so remarkable as a body of knowledge. They are not simply predictive, they are navigational. They were written by people who had lived through at least one previous correction cycle, or who had inherited accounts of previous correction cycles that were precise enough to allow them to describe the next one. And they wrote these warnings not to frighten those who would one day read them, but to equip them. To give them the framework, they would need to act with intention in a time of radical uncertainty. The scribes who carved these warnings into clay did not know us. They did not know the language we speak, or the technology we use, or the specific form that our civilization's distortions would take. But they knew the pattern. They knew the cycle. And they trusted that if someone with the right knowledge was reading their words, that person would be able to translate the pattern into their own context and use it to navigate what was coming. We are now going to go through each of the 7 warnings again, this time in more detail, examining the specific textual evidence, the modern research that intersects with each warning, and the implications for how we understand our current moment. We will spend more time on the 4th warning than on any other, because the 4th warning is the hinge point, the threshold between the warnings that describe approach and the warnings that describe arrival. And we will end with the 7th warning, with the door that opens within the correction cycle, and with what the Sumerians believed was possible for those who could see it. The first warning, examined in depth, begins with a concept that does not have a perfect modern equivalent. The Sumerian scribes distinguished between light that illuminates and light that reveals. These are not the same thing in their framework. Light that illuminates is passive. It makes things visible that were already there. Light that reveals is active. It exposes something that was hidden, something that would not have been seen without the specific quality of light that is doing the revealing. The moon, in ordinary circumstances, was understood by the Sumerians as a source of illuminating light. But the first warning describes a condition in which the moon's light shifts character and becomes revealing light instead. When the moon begins to behave as a mirror rather than a lamp, the text says, "What you see in its light is not what has always been there. What you see is what was approaching but had not yet arrived." In the most technical readings of this passage, the shift from illuminating to revealing light is connected to a specific optical phenomenon that the Sumerians would have been able to observe with the naked eye. The moon's apparent color shifts under certain atmospheric and orbital conditions. When the moon is near the horizon, atmospheric refraction gives it a red or orange color. When the moon is at certain orbital distances, its apparent brightness changes noticeably. And there are rarer phenomena, including certain types of lunar halos and arcs that occur when ice crystals in the upper atmosphere interact with moonlight, that produce effects that a careful ancient observer would immediately recognize as extraordinary. The first warning is connected to exactly these kinds of observable anomalies, but it is not simply a description of optical phenomena. It is a statement about what those phenomena signify. The Sumerian interpretation of unusual lunar optical effects was not superstitious in the pejorative modern sense. It was based on a model of the cosmos in which the moon functioned as an interface between the terrestrial and the cosmic. In the Anunnaki framework, the moon was positioned, literally and metaphorically, at the boundary between the human world and the larger cosmic order. When conditions in the larger cosmic order changed, the moon, positioned at the boundary, would show that change before the change itself arrived at the Earth. Unusual optical effects around the moon were therefore not omens in the sense of arbitrary signs chosen by divine whim to carry meaning. They were physically meaningful indicators of changed conditions in the larger cosmic environment. The moon was a sensor. Its unusual behaviors were sensor readings. This interpretive model is not as alien to modern science as it might initially seem. Modern astronomers do use the moon as a kind of sensor. The lunar retroreflectors placed by the Apollo missions allow scientists to use laser ranging to measure the moon's orbital distance with extraordinary precision, and changes in that distance provide information about the Earth-Moon system that would be difficult to obtain otherwise. The moon's role as a gravitational actor in the solar system means that its orbital behavior reflects the gravitational influences of other bodies. The Sumerians, working without modern instruments, built their sensor model differently, but the underlying logic of using the moon's behavior as a window into larger cosmic conditions is not fundamentally different from what modern astronomers do. What the first warning is watching for, specifically, is a change in the moon's character that indicates a change in the larger cosmic environment. The warning does not specify the nature of that change. It does not need to. The point is simply that when the moon begins to behave as a mirror rather than a lamp, something significant has shifted in the larger system, and that shift will eventually make itself felt on Earth. The first warning is the earliest possible signal, the most distant early warning, the one that comes before any of the others, before the water systems are disrupted, before the gate opens at the wrong time, before the correction cycle engages. The first warning says this: pay attention to the moon's light. When its character changes, begin watching more carefully, because something has already changed that you cannot yet see. The modern research literature on lunar optical effects is not extensive compared to other areas of lunar science, but what exists is interesting. Researchers studying the moon's albedo, its total reflectance, have documented subtle variations over time. The causes of these variations are debated. Some researchers attribute them to changes in the lunar surface itself, caused by micrometeorite bombardment and solar wind exposure. Others have suggested that variations in the solar output affect the moon's reflectance in ways that are not yet fully characterized. What is not contested is that the moon's reflective behavior is not perfectly constant, and that the variations in that behavior carry information about conditions in the Earth-Moon-Sun system that are not easily obtained by other means. The Sumerians were watching the right thing. Whether they were interpreting it correctly is a different question, and one that is beyond what the current evidence can definitively answer. The second warning, in its deeper examination, reveals a sophistication that goes well beyond what the surface reading suggests. The disruption of the Great Below was not simply about floods. The Sumerians understood the underground water systems as connected to the Earth's fertility, and fertility in the ancient Mesopotamian context was not a metaphor. It was a direct reference to the productive capacity of agricultural land, to the quality of soil, to the behavior of the rivers that the entire Mesopotamian civilization depended on for survival. The Great Below, the underground waters, was the reservoir from which this productivity drew. And the second warning's concern with the disruption of the Great Below was a concern with the disruption of the entire productive basis of civilization. In the Sumerian understanding, the underground waters were managed. They were not left to behave randomly. The Anunnaki, in the accounts that describe their activities on Earth, were involved in significant hydraulic engineering. The agricultural productivity of Mesopotamia in the period of Sumerian civilization was not a natural phenomenon. It was the product of an extensive irrigation system that required constant maintenance, and that the Sumerians traced back, in their accounts, to Anunnaki instruction. The canals of Mesopotamia were not simply dug by human hands following human intuition. They followed patterns that the texts describe as having been laid out according to the ordering, the system of me that the Anunnaki established. And the underground water systems that fed those canals were understood as part of the same managed system. When the second warning says that the underground waters will begin to move in ways that do not match the lunar calendar as established, it is describing a breakdown in this managed system. The moon's gravitational influence on the groundwater, as the Sumerians understood it, was regular and predictable. It was part of the ordering. The underground waters moved according to a pattern that the Anunnaki had mapped and that human civilization had learned to work within. When that pattern began to deviate, when the waters moved at the wrong times and in the wrong directions, it was a sign that the management system was failing. Not because of human error, but because the correction cycle was disrupting the underlying parameters that the management system depended on. The modern parallel to this is striking when you look at it directly. Groundwater systems globally are behaving in ways that are described in the scientific literature as anomalous. The behavior of aquifers, of subsurface water movements, of the relationship between surface water and groundwater, is changing in ways that do not fully map to the models that hydrology has developed. Some of this is unquestionably attributable to human extraction, but some of it is not. There are anomalies in groundwater behavior that predate intensive human extraction that have been documented in geological records going back centuries, and that correlate with cycles that are not tied to human activity. These anomalies have attracted attention from researchers who study the long-term behavior of water systems and who have found that the moon's gravitational influence on subsurface water is more complex and more significant than the simple tidal model suggests. The second warning, then, is not simply a historical curiosity. It is a directive. Watch the underground water systems. When they begin to move incorrectly, when their behavior deviates from the established patterns in ways that cannot be fully explained by human activity, acknowledge what that deviation might indicate within the larger framework, not as a cause for panic, as a data point, as a sign within the cascade of signs that the Sumerians identified as the approach and engagement of the correction cycle. The third warning, the one about the gate of the moon, takes us into the deepest and most technically complex part of the Sumerian astronomical framework. To understand it properly, we need to spend some time on the concept of the celestial ordering as the Sumerians understood it. The Sumerians did not see the sky as a random collection of lights. They saw it as a structured system, organized according to principles that the Anunnaki had established and that human astronomers were responsible for tracking and maintaining their awareness of. The stars were grouped into constellations that had specific meanings and that were connected, in the Sumerian framework, to specific aspects of the Anunnaki management system. The planets, which the Sumerians called the sheep that do not rest, were associated with specific Anunnaki figures and were tracked as indicators of those figures' activities and intentions. And the moon was the central organizing element of the whole system, the body through which the other elements of the system communicated their states to careful human observers. The gate of the moon, in this framework, was a specific configuration in which the moon's position in the sky, in relation to the nodes of its orbit and to specific star groups, created what the Sumerians understood as an opening in the celestial structure. A point of passage. The gate was not always open. It opened on a schedule tied to the nodal cycle and to the positions of the visible planets. When the gate opened on its scheduled cycle, it was simply part of the ordering, expected, accounted for. When it opened at a time that deviated from the established schedule, or when it opened in a configuration that did not match the established pattern, it was the third warning. Something in the underlying system had shifted enough that the gate was no longer operating on the expected schedule. And a gate that does not operate on schedule is a sign that the mechanism controlling the gate is malfunctioning. The mechanism the Sumerians attributed the gate's operation to was, in their framework, the Anunnaki management system itself. The gate opened when the Anunnaki opened it, and it closed when they closed it. When it began opening incorrectly, it meant that the management system was either being deliberately modified or was experiencing stress that caused it to operate outside its normal parameters. Either interpretation carries significant implications. If the gate was being deliberately modified, it meant that the Anunnaki were beginning to reconfigure the management system in preparation for the correction cycle. If the gate was experiencing stress, it meant that the correction cycle was already affecting the management system from within. In either case, the third warning is a signal that the system is transitioning from maintenance mode to correction mode. And once that transition begins, the sequence described in the remaining 4 warnings is set in motion. The researchers who have worked most carefully on the third warning have focused on the question of what modern astronomical observations might correspond to the Sumerian description of the gate opening incorrectly. The most promising line of research connects the gate of the moon to the behavior of the lunar nodes in relation to specific fixed star positions that the Sumerians identified as significant. The Pleiades were among the most important star groups in the Sumerian astronomical framework. The position of the moon's node in relation to the Pleiades was tracked carefully in the astronomical texts, and certain configurations involving the lunar node the moon's position at specific orbital phases, and the position of the Pleiades have been identified as corresponding to the Sumerian description of the gate. The question of when this gate opened at the wrong time, outside its expected schedule, involves detailed astronomical calculation that different researchers have approached differently. But several independent analyses have identified the same general period, the late 20th to mid-21st century, as a time of unusual nodal behavior in relation to the relevant star positions. This is consistent with the fourth warning's identification of this same period as the time of the crossing. We are going deeper into the fourth warning now. And to do that properly, we need to understand the concept of the crossing in its fullest Sumerian astronomical context. The crossing was not simply a meeting point of celestial bodies. It was a specific condition that the Sumerians described using a term that scholars have translated as the knot point or the joining, a point at which multiple celestial cycles simultaneously reached a significant phase in their progression. The Sumerians used the metaphor of threads being tied together. Separate threads, each running its own course, suddenly knotting together at a single point. The knot point was where multiple cycles crossed simultaneously, and it was the most significant astronomical event in the Sumerian framework precisely because of its rarity. Individual cycles converging by twos or threes was common enough that the Sumerians had standard procedures for interpreting these events. But the convergence of the larger cycles, the grand cycles of the Anunnaki, was something that happened once in very long periods of time. And when it happened, when all the threads knotted together at once, it marked what the texts describe as the completion of a great reckoning. The Great Reckoning is a concept that appears in several Sumerian texts in different contexts, but always with the same underlying structure. It is the point at which the Anunnaki reviewed the state of their project on Earth. Not continuously, not whenever they chose, but at specific cycle points that were built into the management system from the beginning. The Great Reckoning was scheduled. It was designed into the system. And the correction cycle, the adjustment that followed the reckoning, was also designed in. It was not a crisis management measure. It was maintenance. Scheduled maintenance, built into the operating parameters of the management system. The correction cycle was not the result of something going wrong with the Anunnaki's plan. It was part of the plan. A regular, if infrequent, adjustment to the human civilization project to ensure that it remained within the parameters the management system was designed to maintain. This reframing of the correction cycle from catastrophe to maintenance is important for understanding the tone of the 7 warnings. The scribes who wrote them were not in despair. They were not warning of the end of the world. They were describing a maintenance procedure that they understood from historical precedent, from the flood account and from other records of previous correction events, and they were providing the information needed to navigate that maintenance procedure as intelligently as possible. The warnings are technical documentation, not prophecy of doom. And the fourth warning, the one that marks the beginning of the maintenance procedure, is the most important single piece of information in that documentation because it is the one that answers the question of where we are in the overall schedule. There is a text that has never made it into the popular literature on Sumerian civilization, despite being one of the most extraordinary documents in the entire ancient Mesopotamian archive. It is not unknown to scholars. It sits in the collections of a major European museum, in a physical condition that has made it difficult to work with, its surface worn and partially damaged by the millennia of burial that preceded its excavation in the 19th century. The text is referred to in specialist literature by a catalog number that reveals nothing about its content, and the handful of scholars who have worked with it have published analyses in journals that are not widely read outside the narrow field of ancient Near Eastern studies. But within those analyses, there is something that demands a broader audience. The text is a dialogue between a figure who is identified by a title that translates as the one who keeps the tablets, a scribe or librarian figure, and a figure who is identified as one of the great ones, clearly a reference to the Anunnaki. The dialogue concerns the 7 warnings, not in the sense of presenting them as new information, in the sense of reviewing them as existing information, already known to both parties, already established as part of the record. The Great One is asking the keeper of the tablets whether the 7 warnings have been properly preserved, whether the records are complete, whether the system of recognition will be available to those who will need it in the future. The keeper of the tablets confirms that the records are complete, and then the Great One makes a statement that the surviving portion of the text preserves with unusual clarity. The statement, translated as closely as the scholarship allows, is this: "The 7 will not be believed by those who have not seen the face of the moon. And those who have seen the face of the moon will not need to be told, but the tablets are kept for those in between." This is a remarkable statement. It distinguishes 3 categories of people: Those who have not seen the face of the moon, meaning those who have not had direct experience with whatever it is the moon represents in the Anunnaki framework, and who will therefore dismiss the warnings as fiction. Those who have seen the face, meaning those with direct knowledge, who understand the warnings completely and do not need the text to tell them what they already know, and those in between. The tablets, the Great One says, are kept for those in between, for those who have enough awareness to recognize that something is happening but who do not yet have the full framework to understand what it is. For those who need the information, who are capable of using it, but who have not yet encountered it in a form they can work with. This framing changes everything about how we should understand the 7 warnings. They are not for everyone. They were never intended to be. The Sumerians did not write these texts hoping that the whole of humanity would receive them and be saved by the knowledge they contain. They wrote them for a specific type of person. A person who is already asking questions, who already senses that the official explanations do not fully account for what they are experiencing and observing, who is already looking for a framework that can contain what they know without forcing them to pretend they do not know it. The tablets were kept for that person. And in a remarkable act of civilizational trust, the scribes of ancient Mesopotamia built their warnings carefully enough that they survived thousands of years of war, fire, flood, and deliberate erasure, and arrived in the present moment intact enough to be read. The fact that these texts were preserved is itself remarkable. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, where many of the most important cuneiform tablets were discovered, was deliberately assembled by a king who understood that the knowledge encoded in these tablets was of extraordinary importance. Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century BCE, sent scribes throughout the ancient Near East to collect, copy, and bring back cuneiform texts. He was not simply building a prestige library. His own inscriptions describe the assembly of this library in terms that suggest he understood himself as preserving something that was in danger of being lost, something that would be needed later. Something that the present moment could not fully use, but that the future would. The library of Ashurbanipal was a deliberate act of transmission, an attempt to bridge the gap between an ancient knowledge tradition and an unknown future that would need that knowledge. The Sumerian warnings about the moon are part of that tradition. They represent the most concentrated expression of an astronomical and cosmological understanding that the Sumerians believed was of permanent, not merely historical, significance. And the structure of the 7 warnings, the way they build from observation through physical consequence, through social consequence to the event itself, and then through the aftermath, and finally to the possibility of the 7th warning, that structure is the structure of a navigational document. It is telling a story, but the story is not for entertainment. It is a map, and maps are most useful when you know you are in the territory they describe. Let us return to the 4th warning one more time, because its claim that the correction cycle is already underway deserves to be examined with maximum rigor. The claim rests on 3 pillars. First, the astronomical pillar. The specific celestial configuration described in the 4th warning, the crossing of the moon at a specific alignment point with specific planetary configurations, must be currently occurring or must have recently occurred. Second, the physical pillar. The conditions described in the first 2 warnings, the change in the moon's light and the disruption of underground water systems, must be currently observable. Third, the social pillar. The condition described in the 3rd warning, the loosening of the ordering, must be currently visible in the behavior of human civilization's institutions. If all 3 pillars are present, the 4th warning's claim is supported by the convergence of evidence across multiple domains. On the astronomical pillar, we have already discussed the work of researchers who have identified the current era as a period of exceptional multi-cycle convergence in the Sumerian astronomical framework. The relevant cycles, including the nodal cycle, the longer planetary cycles involving Jupiter and Saturn, and the even longer cycles that the Sumerians tracked through their astronomical tables, are converging in a way that the Sumerian framework would identify as the crossing. The precise identification of when, within this broad period, the crossing is most exactly achieved depends on methodological choices that different researchers have made differently. But the convergence of multiple independent analyses on the same general era is significant. On the physical pillar, we have the documented changes in the moon's observable behavior, including variations in albedo and the anomalies in the lunar laser ranging data, and we have the documented changes in global groundwater systems that have been partially attributed to the moon's gravitational influence on subsurface water behavior. These are real documented phenomena. They are not proof of the Sumerian framework, but they are consistent with it. They are the kinds of observations that the Sumerian scribes would have been tracking, and that they described, in the first 2 warnings, as the early physical signs of the correction cycle's approach. On the social pillar, we have what is arguably the most visible and widely experienced of the three. The systematic inversion of institutional integrity that the fifth warning describes, which is itself a consequence of the fourth warning's correction cycle beginning, is a condition that is recognizable to an enormous number of people across an enormous range of different cultural and political contexts. People who disagree profoundly about politics, about economics, about social organization, share a common observation about the institutions that are supposed to maintain the ordering of civilization. Those institutions are not behaving as they should. They are inverted. The shepherds have turned. This is not a partisan observation. It is a cross-cultural, cross-political observation that is being made simultaneously by people whose specific critiques of specific institutions are completely different from each other. The phenomenon is real, even if its meaning is interpreted differently by different people. The convergence of these three pillars of evidence does not prove that the Sumerian framework is correct in every detail. It does not prove that the Anunnaki existed, or that they manage the earth, or that the moon is a component of their management system. What it does is establish that the Sumerian scribes were tracking real patterns in the natural and social world, and that those patterns are currently displaying the specific signatures that the warnings describe as the indicators of the correction cycle. Whether the correction cycle is, as the Sumerians believed, a managed process implemented by cosmic entities who are responsible for the Earth's maintenance, or whether it is simply a natural cycle that the Sumerians happen to identify and describe with remarkable precision, the implications for how we should understand our current moment are the same. We are in the territory described by the seventh warning. The territory where the correction is underway, and the question is how to navigate it. What did the Sumerians specifically advise for people living inside a correction cycle? The advice is distributed across multiple text types, but it converges on several consistent themes. The first theme is preparation rather than prevention. The correction cycle, in the Sumerian understanding, cannot be stopped any more than the flood could have been stopped. It is a systemic process operating on a scale that exceeds individual or even collective human agency. The appropriate response is not to try to prevent it, but to prepare for it, to identify what is essential and to take steps to preserve it, to identify what is non-essential, including aspects of the current ordering that are already inverted and corrupted, and to let go of them without clinging. The second theme is the maintenance of genuine community. The Sumerian texts are consistent in their emphasis on the importance of real human connection during times of correction, not the managed, mediated connections that the ordering provides through its institutions, but the direct, personal, locally grounded connections between people who share genuine interest in each other's well-being. The flood survivor Utnapishtim was not alone. He was with his family, and he brought with him the seeds of civilization, not the bureaucratic apparatus of the state, but the fundamental human knowledge of agriculture, crafts, and community organization. The correction cycle strips away what is not essential. The preparation for the correction cycle involves getting clear, in advance, about what is essential and ensuring that it is preserved in forms that can survive the stripping. The third theme is the preservation of knowledge. This is perhaps the most explicit directive in the entire Sumerian corpus on the subject of correction cycles. Knowledge, genuine knowledge, the understanding of how natural systems work and how human communities can sustain themselves, is the most precious thing that can be preserved through a period of transformation. The tablets themselves are the clearest expression of this belief. The scribes who wrote them understood that they were creating knowledge repositories that would be needed later. They wrote them in a form that was designed to be durable. They encoded the most important information in multiple ways, as mythology, as astronomy, as ritual instruction, so that even if some of the encodings were lost, others might survive. The seventh warning, the one that describes the door that opens within the correction cycle, is explicitly connected to knowledge. The knowledge that becomes accessible during the correction cycle, the connections that become reestablishable, these are forms of genuine knowledge that the ordering had suppressed or hidden. During the correction cycle, this knowledge surfaces. During the correction cycle, it becomes available to those who are looking for it. This is the most hopeful aspect of the entire seven-warning framework. The correction cycle is not simply destructive. It is also revelatory. It is not simply removing what was false. It is also exposing what is true. The institutional inversions of the fifth warning, while genuinely disruptive, also have the effect of making visible the mechanisms of inversion that were previously hidden. When institutions that are supposed to serve the public interest begin to openly and undeniably serve other interests instead, the nature of those other interests becomes visible in a way that was not possible when the institutions were maintaining a more convincing appearance of integrity. This visibility is not comfortable, but it is useful. It is information. It is knowledge that was hidden and is now, through the process of the correction cycle, becoming accessible. The Sumerian scribes believed that those who paid attention during the correction cycle, who watched what was being revealed rather than looking away, who gathered the knowledge that was surfacing rather than dismissing it, would be in the best possible position to contribute to what came after the correction. The new ordering, they believed, would be shaped by those who had maintained their awareness and their integrity through the disruption. Not by those who had wielded the most power within the old ordering, not by those who had successfully preserved the old ordering's specific forms, but by those who had understood what the correction was doing and had allowed it to do its work without trying to arrest it or to use it for personal advantage. This is a demanding standard. It asks people living inside a correction cycle to do something that is genuinely difficult, to remain clear-eyed about what is happening without becoming either paralyzed by it or opportunistic about it, to preserve what is genuinely essential without becoming attached to specific forms that may need to change, to allow the disruption to reveal what it is revealing without either dismissing the revelation or building a new identity around being the one who received it. The Sumerians were not naive about how hard this was. Their texts are full of accounts of people who failed to navigate correction cycles successfully, who either denied what was happening until it was too late to prepare, or who saw it coming and tried to position themselves advantageously in ways that ultimately did not serve them. The survivors of the flood were the ones who listened when they were told what was coming, who prepared without fully understanding, who trusted the framework even when the evidence was not yet definitive, who were already in their vessel when the waters rose. We are, if the fourth warning is correct, in that moment. The waters have not yet risen to the level that makes the situation undeniable. The institutional inversions are accelerating but not yet complete. The physical disruptions are measurable but not yet catastrophic. The astronomical phenomena are occurring but not yet widely recognized for what they signify. We are in the early part of the correction cycle, in the territory between the fourth and sixth warnings, in the territory where preparation is still possible, and where the knowledge that is surfacing through the disruption is still accessible to those who are looking for it. The seventh warning's door is open. The question is whether we walk through it with enough understanding to use what we find on the other side. The moon has been humanity's most intimate celestial companion for the entire span of human existence on this planet. No other body in the sky is as close, as large in apparent size, as consistently present, and as directly influential on the rhythms of terrestrial life. Every culture in every period of human history has looked at the moon and known that it matters. But the question of why it matters, of what its presence in our sky actually means for the world below, has been answered very differently by different traditions. The dominant modern answer is that the moon matters because of its gravitational effect on tides and its role in stabilizing the Earth's axial tilt, which in turn creates the climate conditions that allow complex life to exist. This is a correct answer as far as it goes, but the Sumerians would have said it does not go nearly far enough. The Sumerian understanding of the moon's importance was not primarily gravitational, although the Sumerians clearly understood that the moon affected water systems in ways that went beyond the visible surface tides. Their understanding was systemic. The moon was not one influence among many in a randomly assembled natural environment. It was a component of a designed system, and a designed component has a purpose that exceeds its observable physical properties, the same way that a valve in an engine has a purpose that exceeds its observable physical properties. You can describe the valve's physical dimensions and the forces it is subject to without ever understanding what it is for. To understand what it is for, you need to understand the system it is part of. The Sumerians believed they understood the system the moon was part of, and the 7 warnings emerge from that systemic understanding. Let us trace the history of that systemic understanding as it appears in the ancient texts. The earliest Sumerian texts that survive, the administrative records and hymns from the 3rd millennium BCE, already treat the moon's role in the cosmic system as established knowledge rather than developing understanding. The moon god Nana is described in these early texts with full theological elaboration. His relationships with the other members of the Anunnaki pantheon are defined. His specific responsibilities within the management of the earth are outlined. His cycles are precisely defined in relation to the broader astronomical framework. This is not the beginning of a tradition. This is the middle of a tradition. The first Sumerian texts already presuppose a fully developed theological and astronomical understanding of the moon's role. Where does this understanding come from? The Sumerians themselves were clear. It came from the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki, in the Sumerian accounts, did not simply appear as anthropomorphic deities in a primitive religious imagination. They appeared as the creators and managers of the system within which human civilization existed. The Sumerian word for the Anunnaki is typically analyzed as meaning something like those of royal blood or princely ones, and they are described as a group of high-ranking entities within a larger cosmic hierarchy. They came from Anu, the sky. They descended to Earth. They had needs, including the need for a civilization to maintain the systems they had built. And they had technology that the texts describe with considerable specificity in ways that do not map cleanly onto the supernatural powers attributed to deities in the conventional mythological reading. The Anunnaki technology described in the Sumerian texts includes, depending on which texts you are reading and which interpretive framework you apply, descriptions of flying vehicles, of advanced metallurgical processes, of medical and genetic manipulation, of astronomical instruments, and of communication technologies. Mainstream scholars read these descriptions as mythological elaborations, as primitive attempts to understand natural phenomena through the lens of divine agency. Researchers working in the ancient astronaut framework read them as technical descriptions of real technologies that the Sumerians encountered and attempted to describe using the vocabulary available to them. Neither reading can be definitively proven from the available evidence. But the ancient astronaut reading has one significant advantage. It treats the Sumerians as intelligent people who were describing what they actually observed and experienced, rather than as primitive people who were projecting anthropomorphic meaning onto natural phenomena they did not understand. The Sumerians were clearly intelligent. We have established that beyond any reasonable doubt, their mathematical, astronomical, and administrative achievements are the record of an intelligent civilization engaged in systematic inquiry. When they described entities coming from the sky who possessed technology that exceeded their own, when they described those entities as having established the management systems that governed their civilization, when they embedded in their most carefully preserved texts a series of warnings about the moon that reflect genuine astronomical knowledge, combined with a systemic framework for understanding the moon's role, they were not doing something different from the careful, systematic recording they did in every other domain. They were doing the same thing, recording what they knew in as much detail as they could for those who would need the information later. The question of whether the Anunnaki were real, in the literal sense of being extraterrestrial beings who arrived on Earth and established a management system, is a question that the available evidence cannot definitively answer in either direction. The Sumerian texts describe them as real. The texts are internally consistent on this point across thousands of years of textual production. The accounts of Anunnaki activities, while containing mythological elaboration, have a structural consistency that is more compatible with preserved historical memory than with pure fictional invention. The specific details of Anunnaki activities, their cities, their specific individuals and their relationships, their conflicts and their resolutions have the texture of historical accounts rather than mythology. But texture is not proof. And the question of proof in this domain is genuinely difficult because the kinds of evidence that would definitively prove or disprove the literal existence of the Anunnaki have either not been found or have not been recognized for what they are. What we can say with confidence is that the knowledge embedded in the Sumerian texts, including the 7 warnings about the moon, reflects a level of understanding of astronomical and terrestrial systems that demands explanation. If the Anunnaki were not real teachers who brought this knowledge to the Sumerians, then the knowledge must have developed through a human tradition that is not reflected in the archaeological record as we currently have it. There must have been a long prior period of sophisticated astronomical observation and mathematical development that left no traces we have found. That is possible. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But it is equally possible that the Sumerians' own account of how they received this knowledge is accurate, that it was given to them by beings who possessed it already, beings who had reasons of their own for wanting a human civilization to exist and to maintain certain kinds of awareness, beings who, when they decided to depart or to reduce their direct involvement, left behind a set of warnings to help the civilization they had built navigate the cycles that would continue after they were gone. The departure of the Anunnaki is itself a significant element of the Sumerian cosmological narrative. The texts do not describe the Anunnaki as permanent residents of Earth. They describe a period of intensive involvement, during which the Anunnaki were actively present and actively managing the human civilization project. And they describe a change in this arrangement, a point at which the Anunnaki reduced their direct involvement and eventually departed, leaving behind only the institutional structures they had established and the knowledge they had encoded in the texts. The departure is described differently in different texts. In some accounts, it is a gradual withdrawal. In others, it is a more abrupt event connected to specific historical circumstances, including the flood. But across the different accounts, the essential picture is the same. The Anunnaki were here. They are no longer here in the same way, and they may return. The sixth warning, the return of those who went before, is connected to this narrative of departure and potential return. The departure narrative is one of the most underexamined aspects of Sumerian cosmology. Most of the attention, both from mainstream scholars and from ancient astronaut researchers, has focused on the arrival and the activities of the Anunnaki during their period of direct involvement. The departure is treated as a relatively minor element, but within the framework of the 7 warnings, the departure is crucial because it establishes the context in which the warnings were written. The warnings were written for a period after the departure, for a time when the Anunnaki were no longer directly present to manage the system they had built, for a time when human civilization would be running, in effect, on autopilot, operating within the management structures the Anunnaki had established but without the direct oversight that had previously been available. And the correction cycle is what happens, in this framework, when the autopilot has been running long enough that the accumulated drift has moved the system outside acceptable parameters. This is a genuinely interesting model for thinking about civilizational dynamics, independent of whether you believe the Anunnaki were literally real. The model says that any managed system operating without active management over a long enough period will drift. The drift is not catastrophic immediately, it is gradual. Systems have inertia. The structures and norms that the original management put in place persist for a long time without direct maintenance. But eventually the drift accumulates. The structures begin to degrade. The norms begin to invert. The physical systems that the management had calibrated begin to move outside their calibrated parameters. And at some point, the accumulated drift reaches a threshold that triggers a correction. Not a deliberate decision by anyone in particular, a systemic response to systemic drift. A return, through whatever mechanism is available, toward the parameters that the system was designed to operate within. The human parallel to this model is visible everywhere in the history of civilizations. Every civilization that has ever existed has experienced periods of drift, periods of correction, and periods of rebuilding. The specific forms of these periods vary enormously, but the pattern is consistent. And what the Sumerian framework adds to this general observation about civilizational dynamics is the specific claim that the correction cycles are not random. They are not simply the result of the particular mistakes of particular generations. They are tied to astronomical cycles, to the behavior of the moon and the planets, to the larger cosmic environment in which the Earth's human civilization exists. The correction cycles happen when they happen because the astronomical cycles say they should happen. And those astronomical cycles were, in the Sumerian framework, set in place by the same beings who set up the human civilization management system in the first place. The correction cycles are the scheduled maintenance that the designers built into their design. Whether you accept this framework literally, or use it as a metaphor for understanding civilizational dynamics, the 7 warnings retain their value as a navigational tool. They describe, with striking precision, the sequence of conditions that characterize a correction period. They provide a framework for understanding those conditions, not as random catastrophes, but as stages in a known process. They offer specific guidance for how to navigate each stage. And they culminate in the 7th warning, the one that offers the possibility of the door, the opening within the disruption that allows those who can see it to participate consciously in shaping what comes after. The concept of the door in the 7th warning deserves deeper exploration than it typically receives in the literature that discusses the Sumerian warnings. The word used in the original text, in the versions that researchers have been able to work with, is not simply a spatial metaphor for opportunity. In the Sumerian context, doors and gates were cosmologically significant. The gate of the moon that appears in the 3rd warning is one example. The 7 gates through which Inanna descends to the underworld in the descent narrative are another. Gates and doors, in the Sumerian framework, were interfaces between different states of reality, between the living world and the underworld, between the human world and the divine world, between the ordinary state of reality and states that were otherwise inaccessible. When the 7th warning describes a door opening within the correction cycle, it is using this cosmological language precisely. The door is not simply a metaphor for favorable circumstances. It is a description of a genuine interface opening, a point at which something that is normally not accessible becomes accessible. Something that is normally hidden becomes visible. Something that is normally impossible becomes possible. What specifically becomes accessible, becomes visible, becomes possible within the correction cycle. The 7th warning is deliberately general on this point, for the same reason that the warnings are written for those in between rather than for those who already know. Those who already know do not need to be told specifically what opens up. Those who are in between need the general indication that something opens up, the encouragement to look for it, and the framework within which to understand it when they find it. The seventh warning is saying this: you are in a correction cycle. The disruption is real, the changes are real. But within the disruption, within the changes, there is something that the correction is revealing, something that the old ordering was suppressing. Find it, not because it will make things comfortable again, but because it is true, because it is part of the genuine ordering that underlies the false ordering, because knowing it is how you participate in what comes next. This is the deepest teaching of the 7 warnings. Not the specific predictions about astronomical events or water systems or institutional behavior. Those are useful, and they are important, and they are the evidential foundation for taking the framework seriously. But the deepest teaching is this: the correction cycle has a purpose. It is not punitive. It is not arbitrary. It is a return towards something genuine after a period of drift away from it. And those who understand this, who can see the return in what feels like loss, who can find the door in what looks like a wall, who can use the disruption to access what the disruption is revealing, those people are exactly who the scribes of ancient Nippur were writing for. Those are the people in between. Those are the people the tablets were kept for. The moon stands at the crossing. The configuration described in the 4th warning is not a future event. It is a current or recent event, depending on which specific calculation you accept and which part of the crossing period you consider decisive. The waters of the great below are moving in ways that do not match the established pattern. The institutions that were supposed to maintain the ordering are demonstrably operating outside the parameters of their founding purpose. The gate opened, the reckoning began. And we are in the middle of it, right now in this moment, living through the sequence that the Sumerian scribes encoded into clay tablets thousands of years ago and trusted would survive long enough to find us. They were right to trust. The tablets survived. The knowledge survived. The warnings survived. And the 7th warning, the last one, the one that offers the door rather than describes the disruption, is the most important piece of information the scribes preserved. Because it tells us that this is not the end of anything. It is a threshold. It is a passage. And on the other side of the passage, the new ordering begins. Not inevitably better in every way than what preceded it, but genuine, not inverted. Not drifted beyond recognition from the parameters it was meant to operate within. A civilization that has passed through the correction and come out the other side with the knowledge of what it passed through and why. This is what the Sumerians believed was possible. This is what they wrote their warnings to enable. This is what the 7th warning offers. Not safety in the old sense, not a return to business as usual, but the possibility of participation in something real, something that comes after the correction has done its work. Something that is shaped by those who understood what was happening and who used that understanding to preserve what was essential and to release what was not. Something that begins, as all orderings begin, with the moon standing in a new position in the sky, carrying out a new phase of its work, reflecting a new configuration of the cosmic environment, and doing what it has always done, since long before human civilization began to watch it, since long before the Sumerians pressed their warnings into clay, fulfilling its function in the larger system. Being the component it was designed to be, doing the work it was placed here to do. Now let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the warnings, but the beginning of what produced them. Because to fully reckon with what the 7 warnings mean for us now, we need to understand the civilization that wrote them as completely as we can, not as a curiosity from the ancient past, but as a sophisticated society whose experience of the cosmos was more direct, in certain critical ways, than our own. We live in an age of extraordinary technological power. We can observe the universe at scales and with precision that would have been inconceivable to any ancient civilization. We have instruments that can detect gravitational waves from collisions of black holes a billion light-years away. We have telescopes that can image the first galaxies that formed in the early universe. We have computational power that can model the behavior of complex systems across timescales that exceed the age of the solar system. And with all of this, we are in some ways further from direct experiential knowledge of the cosmos than the Sumerians were. We observed the universe through layers of technological mediation. They observed it with their own eyes, night after night, year after year, for generations upon generations. The knowledge they built was slow, patient, embodied, and continuous in a way that our knowledge is not. The Sumerian astronomical tradition did not begin with the Sumerians themselves. The tablets make this clear. The observational records they drew on were already old when the Sumerian scribal tradition formalized them. The earliest Sumerian texts reference astronomical knowledge that is presented as received from the Anunnaki in a prior period, not developed through human observation alone. This complicates the picture considerably. If the Sumerian astronomical knowledge was a combination of genuine, long-term human observation and direct transmission from a technologically advanced source, then the level of precision we find in their astronomical records makes perfect sense. It does not need to be explained by postulating a lost advanced human civilization. It can be explained, on the Sumerians' own terms, as the product of a collaboration between human observers and non-human teachers who brought knowledge already complete. The astronomical tablets that encode the 7 warnings are a subset of this larger astronomical tradition. They are not separable from the rest of the tradition. They are woven into it. The same mathematical framework that produces the precise star catalogs produces the cycle calculations on which the warnings are based. The same observational tradition that generates the Venus tablets of Amizaduga generates the data about lunar behavior that the 1st and 3rd warnings rely on. This is not a coincidence. It is the opposite of a coincidence. It is evidence that the warnings are embedded in a genuine astronomical framework and are not after-the-fact mythological additions to an otherwise scientific body of knowledge. The warnings and the astronomy are the same thing, viewed from different angles. The astronomy provides the data. The warnings interpret the data within the systemic framework of what the moon is for and what its behavior means within that framework. The concept of what the moon is for brings us to one of the most contested questions in the entire domain of alternative lunar research. Is the moon natural or artificial? This sounds, on the surface, like a question with an obvious answer. Of course, the moon is natural. It formed through the giant impact hypothesis, the theory that a Mars-sized body collided with the early Earth approximately 4.5 billion years ago, and the debris from that collision coalesced into the moon. This is the mainstream scientific consensus, and it is based on genuine evidence. The isotopic composition of lunar rocks matches the isotopic composition of Earth rocks in ways that are consistent with a common origin. The lack of a lunar iron core, which distinguishes the moon from most rocky bodies in the solar system, is consistent with the formation of the moon from the Earth's mantle material, rather than from a primordial accretion of solar system material, including iron-rich core material. But the giant impact hypothesis has anomalies that have not been fully resolved. The moon's orbit is unusual in ways that the giant impact hypothesis has difficulty fully explaining. The moon is much larger relative to its host planet than any other moon in the solar system. The moon's orbital inclination, which should reflect the impact dynamics of the body that formed it, is slightly but measurably different from what the most precise simulations of the giant impact predict. The moon's orbital recession rate, the 3.8 centimeters per year of outward movement, should be slowing down as the moon moves further from Earth because the tidal forces driving the recession weaken with distance. The current rate is slightly faster than models predict it should be at the moon's current distance. These anomalies are not large enough to overthrow the giant impact hypothesis. But they are large enough to suggest that the full picture is more complex than the standard model captures. The moon's interior is the most anomalous aspect of all. The seismic data from the Apollo missions established that the moon rings like a hollow metallic body when struck. This is not a feature of a body that formed from the accretion of rocky debris. A body formed from debris accretion should have a density gradient that increases toward the center, should have a core richer in heavy elements than the surface, and should dampen seismic energy rather than amplifying and prolonging it. The moon does none of these things in the way the standard model predicts. Its seismic behavior is anomalous. Its interior structure, to the extent that the seismic data allows us to characterize it, is anomalous. And its composition, which is in some ways simpler and more uniform than the giant impact hypothesis would predict, is anomalous. None of these anomalies prove that the moon is artificial. They are consistent with natural formation processes that we do not yet fully understand. The universe is large and complex, and the range of outcomes that natural processes can produce is wider than our models currently capture. But these anomalies are also consistent with the Sumerian description of the moon as a vessel, as a constructed object placed in orbit for a purpose. And when you combine the physical anomalies with the Sumerian framework's insistence on the moon as a managed component of a designed system, you have at least the outlines of an alternative hypothesis that deserves rigorous examination rather than reflexive dismissal. The hypothesis is this: the moon, whatever its origin, functions as a component of a management system for the Earth. Whether it was deliberately placed in its current position, or whether it was a natural body that was co-opted for this purpose, is a secondary question. The primary claim is that the moon's behavior is not fully explained by its physical properties and orbital mechanics alone. That it responds to, or is responsive to, influences and purposes that go beyond what the standard model of a naturally occurring satellite would predict. That the Sumerians were describing this system accurately when they said the moon was a vessel placed by the Anunnaki? Not necessarily that they were describing a physical truth in every detail, but that they were describing a functional truth. The moon functions as a vessel. It functions as a component. And the 7 warnings are based on the careful observation of how that component behaves in relation to the larger system it is part of. This is not a position that can be proven from the available evidence. It is a position that is consistent with the available evidence, including evidence that the standard model has difficulty accommodating. And in a domain where definitively proving or disproving the claim is not currently possible, consistency with evidence is the standard we should apply. The Sumerian framework is consistent with the evidence. The anomalies in the moon's behavior and structure are consistent with the Sumerian framework. The 7 warnings are consistent with the sequence of conditions we currently observe in the natural and social world. Consistency does not equal truth, but it earns the right to be taken seriously. And the Sumerian warnings have more than earned that right. Let us now look at the specific modern evidence for each of the 7 warnings in turn, beginning again with the first and working through to the 7th. This time, we will be more specific about what the evidence shows and what it does not show. The first warning, about the moon behaving as a mirror rather than a lamp, intersects with modern research on the moon's albedo in an interesting way. The moon's average albedo is approximately 0.12, meaning it reflects about 12% of the sunlight that hits it. This is relatively low. The moon is dark by the standards of most bodies in the solar system. But the albedo is not uniform across the lunar surface, and it is not perfectly constant over time. The Maria, the dark basaltic plains that form the features visible to the naked eye, have albedos as low as 0.07. The highlands have albedos as high as 0.3. The difference between the darkest and lightest parts of the lunar surface is significant enough to be visible to the naked eye as the variations in tone that make up the man in the moon pattern. And on a longer timescale, the moon's overall albedo does vary, though the variations are small and the causes are not fully understood. Solar wind bombardment darkens the lunar surface through a process called space weathering. Micrometeorite impacts can refresh the surface and temporarily increase reflectivity. Changes in the solar output affect how much light is available to reflect. And there are subtler influences, including the electromagnetic environment of the Earth-Moon system, that modern research is only beginning to characterize. The first warning is not specifically about any of these well-understood effects. It is about a qualitative change in the moon's light that the Sumerian scribes associated with a change in the larger cosmic environment. The most interesting modern parallel to this is not in the albedo research, but in research on what is called the moon's electromagnetic environment. The moon has no global magnetic field of its own, but it has localized magnetic anomalies, regions of the lunar surface that are magnetized in patterns that do not fit simple explanations. The moon sits within the Earth's magnetosphere for a portion of its orbit and outside it for the rest. The behavior of the electromagnetic environment around the moon is therefore complex, varying with the moon's position relative to the Earth and the Sun, and sensitive to changes in the solar wind. Changes in the solar wind, which itself varies on cycles that overlap with some of the cycles the Sumerians were tracking, affect the electromagnetic environment around the moon in ways that would, in principle, affect the moon's visible appearance through effects on the thin lunar exosphere, the tenuous envelope of atoms that cling to the moon's surface. These effects are subtle, at the limit of naked eye observability under the best conditions. But Sumerian astronomers observing the sky night after night for generations from locations that had none of the light pollution that compromises modern observation were working at the limit of naked eye observability in a very different and, in some ways, more favorable way. The first warning, then, is consistent with what we know about the moon's electromagnetic sensitivity. A change in the larger cosmic environment that manifested as changes in the solar wind would affect the moon's electromagnetic environment and could, under the right conditions, produce observable changes in the quality of the moon's reflected light. The Sumerians were watching for exactly this kind of change, and they attributed it correctly, in the functional sense, to changes in the larger cosmic environment rather than to random variation in the moon's own properties. The second warning, about the disruption of underground water systems, intersects with a body of modern research that is larger and more definitive than the albedo research. The relationship between the moon and groundwater has been studied in multiple independent research programs, and the results are consistent. The moon's gravitational influence on the Earth's water extends below the surface. The diurnal and semi-diurnal tidal components that drive ocean tides also affect groundwater pressure in confined aquifer systems. The effect is measurable in wells, where water levels rise and fall in response to the lunar tidal cycle in ways that are well documented and well understood. But beyond this well understood effect, there are longer period influences that are less well understood. The monthly and annual lunar cycles produce measurable effects on groundwater recharge rates and on the behavior of springs and seeps that do not fit simple models of precipitation and runoff. Some of these effects have been attributed to the influence of the moon on atmospheric pressure, which in turn affects groundwater dynamics. Others are less easily explained. And over the longer period cycles that the Sumerians were tracking, the nodal cycle and the longer planetary cycles, there are patterns in groundwater behavior that have been documented in some research programs, but that have not received the sustained scientific attention they deserve. The disruption of global groundwater systems that is currently ongoing is the most acute physical expression of the second warning in the modern context. Aquifer depletion is accelerating worldwide. Underground water that took millennia to accumulate is being extracted in decades. Subsurface water systems that supported agriculture for generations are failing. The patterns of groundwater behavior that human civilization has built its agricultural and industrial infrastructure around are shifting in ways that create cascading vulnerabilities across the entire global food system. This is happening too fast to be explained entirely by the moon's gravitational influence. Human extraction is the primary driver of the acute phase of this crisis. But the Sumerian framework would say that the human extraction is itself part of the correction cycle's dynamic. The institutional inversions of the fifth warning, the failure of the shepherds to maintain the ordering, produce exactly the kind of short-term extraction at the expense of long-term sustainability that is now depleting global groundwater systems. The physical disruption and the social disruption are not independent. They are coupled. They reinforce each other. The disruption of the Great Below is happening both because of moon-influenced changes in groundwater dynamics and because of the institutional failures that the correction cycle produces in human management of water resources. The Sumerians would not have distinguished between these two aspects of the disruption. They would have seen both as expressions of the same underlying correction cycle. The third warning, about the gate of the moon opening at the wrong time, intersects with modern astronomical research on the lunar nodal cycle and its effects on terrestrial systems. The 18.6-year nodal cycle affects the range of tidal extremes, with tidal amplitudes increasing significantly during certain phases of the nodal cycle. Researchers studying the relationship between the nodal cycle and extreme weather events have found correlations that suggest the moon's nodal position is a relevant factor in the occurrence of certain kinds of atmospheric and oceanic extremes. These correlations are not universally accepted in mainstream climatology, but they have been documented in multiple independent analyses, and they are consistent with the Sumerian model, in which the moon's nodal behavior influences terrestrial conditions through mechanisms that include but are not limited to the direct gravitational effect on ocean tides. The loosening of the ordering that the third warning describes in social and institutional terms is, in the modern context, visible across a remarkable range of institutional domains simultaneously. Legal systems that are supposed to apply consistently regardless of the wealth and power of the parties involved are visibly failing to do so. Financial systems that are supposed to serve the broad productive economy are demonstrably serving narrower interests at the expense of that economy. Information systems that are supposed to enable citizens to make informed decisions about their collective lives are generating increasing volumes of content that makes informed decision-making harder rather than easier. Educational institutions that are supposed to prepare the next generation for the challenges they will face are increasingly disconnected from the actual challenges that the next generation faces. This is the institutional inversion of the fifth warning, but it is also the beginning of the loosening described in the third warning. The systems are not yet fully inverted. They retain residual functionality in many areas, but the direction of change is consistent. And the direction is toward the condition described in the warnings. The fourth warning, the one that has begun, the crossing of the moon at the configuration written before the flood, is the pivot point around which all of the others turn. And returning to it now, after having examined all of the other warnings in detail, we can see something that is not immediately obvious from a surface reading. The fourth warning is written in past tense, not simply to indicate that by the time someone reads it, the event will be underway. It is written in past tense because the scribes who wrote it understood that the crossing, the convergence of cycles, does not have a single precise moment of occurrence. It is a period, a window of time during which the configuration builds toward its maximum alignment and then slowly resolves. The beginning of the crossing is the past tense moment, the full alignment is the present. and the resolution of the alignment extends into the future as the cycles that converged begin to separate again. This means that the fourth warning's claim is not about a single astronomical event that either has or has not happened. It is about a period that we are in the middle of. The cycles that the fourth warning describes were beginning to converge before we were born. They are converging most fully now, in this era, in this generation, and they will begin to separate over the coming decades as the individual cycles continue their separate progressions. We are in the maximum convergence window. We are at the crossing. And the correction cycle that the fourth warning marks the beginning of is therefore in its most active phase. The conditions described in the fifth and sixth warnings are not approaching. They are here. The fifth warning, the systematic inversion of institutional integrity, is the most immediately verifiable of the seven in modern experience because it is the one that most directly corresponds to what the largest number of people are experiencing in their daily lives. The fifth warning describes a condition in which the shepherds have turned, in which the institutions that exist to maintain the ordering have become the primary vehicles through which the ordering is undermined. In the modern context, this manifests in ways that are documented, measurable, and widely recognized, even by people who do not understand them within the framework the Sumerians provided. Consider the specific domains the Sumerians identified as central to the ordering: kingship, the organization of political power, the crafts, the productive economy, record-keeping, the management of information, ritual, the collective practices that bind communities together, healing, the maintenance of physical health, justice, the adjudication of disputes according to established norms, agriculture, the management of food production. In every one of these domains, the modern equivalents of the Sumerian institutions show the same pattern of inversion: political systems that invert the relationship between power and service, economic systems that invert the relationship between production and wealth, information systems that invert the relationship between content and truth, community practices that invert the relationship between form and meaning, healthcare systems that invert the relationship between health and profit, legal systems that invert the relationship between principle and outcome, agricultural systems that invert the relationship between productivity and sustainability. These inversions are not equally advanced in every domain or every region, and they are contested, often fiercely, by people within each domain who recognize what is happening and who are working against the inversion. The fifth warning does not say that the inversion will be total or that resistance to it will be ineffective. It says that the inversion will be systematic, that it will affect every domain of institutional life, and that it will accelerate as the correction cycle deepens. The resistance to it is also part of the correction cycle's dynamic. The conflict between those who benefit from the inversion and those who resist it is part of what the correction produces as it works through the system. This conflict is visible in every domain that the fifth warning describes, and it is intensifying, not because the world is simply becoming more polarized in a meaningless way, but because the correction cycle is forcing into visibility conflicts between genuinely incompatible visions of what the institutions are supposed to be for. The sixth warning, the return of those who went before, is the most difficult to map onto modern evidence precisely because it is the warning whose content is most dependent on accepting the literal reality of the Anunnaki narrative. If the Anunnaki were real, if they departed the Earth at some point in the past, and if they built a management system that includes a return cycle connected to the correction cycle, then the sixth warning is saying something very specific about what we should expect to happen as the correction deepens. Something is coming, or returning. Something that the correction cycle is connected to in ways that go beyond the internal dynamics of human civilization. The sixth warning is the most extraterrestrial of the seven in its implications, and it is the one that is hardest to support or refute with current observable evidence. What we can say is that the sixth warning's connection to the return of those who went before is consistent with a pattern in the Sumerian text that appears repeatedly in contexts associated with correction cycles. The flood was preceded, in the Sumerian account, by a specific kind of communication between the Anunnaki and at least one human being, Utnapishtim, who was given advanced knowledge of what was coming and instructions for how to prepare. The correction cycle described in the warnings is also expected in the Sumerian framework to be preceded by some form of communication or indication from those who manage the cycle. The sixth warning is that indication. It is the warning that says the return is coming, that those who went before are approaching the point of return, and that this return is the signal that the correction cycle is entering its final phase. Whether you interpret this literally, as a claim about the literal return of extraterrestrial beings, or metaphorically, as a claim about the return of knowledge or principles that were lost when the previous ordering collapsed, or symbolically, as a reference to the cyclical return of cosmic conditions that the Anunnaki were associated with. The sixth warning is saying something that is coherent and consistent with the overall framework. Something is returning. The correction cycle is connected to a return of something that was absent during the long period of the old ordering's drift. And that return is both the climax of the correction cycle and the beginning of the transition to the new ordering. The seventh warning, which is where we have arrived now after following the thread through all of its preceding six, is the most intimate of the seven, the most personal, the most directly addressed to the individual who is reading or hearing it. The sixth warning is about cosmic dynamics. The seventh warning is about what you do, not in the abstract sense of prescribing a behavior for all people in all contexts, but in the specific sense of pointing to something that becomes available in the middle of all this disruption and change and return to those who are paying attention. The door that the seventh warning describes is not a metaphor for getting lucky or being in the right place at the right time. It is a description of a genuine epistemological opening. The correction cycle, by stripping away the false orderings, the inverted institutions, the accumulated drift of the old system, creates conditions in which genuine knowledge becomes more accessible rather than less. The noise level drops, counterintuitively, even as the visible disruption increases. The knowledge that the old ordering suppressed or buried, the genuine understanding of how the cosmic system works, of what the moon is and what it does and what the Anunnaki were and what their management system was for, becomes accessible to those who are actively looking for it, because the institutional gatekeepers of the old ordering are increasingly distracted by the challenge of managing its collapse. This is the door. This is the seventh warning's gift within the disruption. The knowledge is available. The frameworks are accessible. The connections are reestablishable. The Sumerian scribes who wrote these warnings, who encoded them in clay, and trusted them to survive thousands of years, were contributing to the availability of that knowledge. They were sending it forward across time, knowing that it would arrive when it was needed, knowing that those in between would find it and would recognize it, and would use it to navigate what they were living through. We are those people. We are in between. We have found the tablets, or something equivalent to them. We are reading the warnings. And the seventh warning says that this is not an accident. That finding the knowledge is itself part of what the door makes possible. That the act of recognizing what the warnings describe, of understanding that the fourth one has started, of seeing the correction cycle for what it is rather than experiencing it as random chaos, is the beginning of walking through the door. What is on the other side of the door is what the new ordering becomes. Not inevitably, not automatically, not without the active participation of those who can see clearly enough to contribute intentionally. The new ordering is not a gift that arrives fully formed. It is something that is built, in the aftermath of the correction, by those who survived it with their understanding intact, by those who preserved what was genuinely essential, by those who released what was not, by those who used the revelation of the correction cycle to see, clearly and without the filters of the old ordering's distortions, what the world actually is and what it actually needs, and what the cosmic system that contains it is actually doing. The moon will stand in a new position when the correction cycle completes. It will not stop being what it is. It will not stop doing what it does. The component will remain in the system. The system will continue to function. But the relationship between the moon and the human civilization below it will be different, because the human civilization itself will be different. Not all of human civilization. Not perfectly, not completely. The correction cycles in the Sumerian account never produce perfect outcomes. They produce resets, returns toward the parameters the system was designed to operate within. And from those resets, from those returns, human civilization rebuilds within the ordering, rather than drifting away from it. For a time. Until the drift accumulates again, and the next correction cycle begins its long approach. This is the cosmological context within which the seven warnings exist. Not as a prophecy of final catastrophe, not as a promise of final salvation, as a description of the ongoing dynamic between human civilization and the cosmic system it exists within. A dynamic that the Sumerians understood, that the Anunnaki taught them, that has been unfolding for longer than any of the civilizations we call ancient. A dynamic that does not end, that simply cycles. That returns toward its parameters when it drifts. That uses the moon as its instrument and its signal. That produced, in a moment of extraordinary civilizational self-awareness, seven warnings pressed into clay and sent forward across millennia to find us here, in this moment, at the crossing, in the middle of the fourth warning's already begun reckoning, looking at the moon and finally beginning to understand what it is we are looking at. The history of how the Sumerian tablets were found is itself a story that tells us something about the nature of the knowledge they contain and the conditions that allowed that knowledge to survive. The rediscovery of ancient Mesopotamia is one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of archaeology. For most of recorded Western history, the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia existed only as references in the biblical texts, as names without archaeology, as claims without physical corroboration. Babylon, Nineveh, the land between the rivers that the Greeks called Mesopotamia, these were known to educated people as places mentioned in Scripture, but they had no physical presence in the modern world. No ruins, no artifacts, no tablets, simply names in old texts. This changed dramatically in the 19th century, when European explorers and archaeologists began excavating the mounds of present-day Iraq and finding beneath layers of accumulated mud and debris the remains of civilizations that predated Greece and Rome by thousands of years. The finds were extraordinary. Entire cities, preserved by the dry climate and the depth of their burial. Palaces and temples decorated with stone reliefs depicting figures and events that matched descriptions in biblical and classical texts. And tablets, tens of thousands of clay tablets, baked hard by fires that had destroyed the buildings around them, covered in the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script that no living person had been able to read for over 2,000 years. The decipherment of cuneiform was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 19th century. It was accomplished through a combination of methodological rigor, linguistic genius, and what can only be described as extraordinary perseverance. The key was the Behistun inscription, a multilingual proclamation carved into a cliff face in Persia by order of the Persian king Darius the Great. The inscription recorded the same text in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, all written in variants of cuneiform script. Because Old Persian could be partially read through its relationship to later Persian languages and through Greek references to Persian royal titulature, scholars were able to use the Behistun inscription as a Rosetta Stone for cuneiform in general. By the mid-19th century, cuneiform could be read, and what the tablets said, when they could be read, was nothing like what anyone had expected. The tablet said that the stories in the Bible had predecessors, much older predecessors. The story of the flood, which scholars had assumed was a uniquely Israelite revelation, turned out to be a Babylonian story that was substantially older than the biblical version, and that contained details including the preservation of animals on the ark and the release of birds to test whether the waters had receded, that matched the biblical version with a closeness that could not be explained as coincidence. The story of creation, the story of the Garden of Eden, the story of the first humans, all of these had Mesopotamian predecessors, not vague parallels, detailed correspondences. Stories that the biblical texts had clearly drawn on, sometimes closely following the Mesopotamian originals, sometimes adapting them significantly, but always in ways that revealed the underlying borrowing. This discovery was intellectually explosive. It challenged assumptions about the unique origins of Western religion that had held for centuries. It raised questions about the relationship between the biblical narrative and the much older Mesopotamian tradition from which it had partly derived. And it opened the door to a re-examination of the entire Mesopotamian textual corpus, not simply as a collection of predecessors to the biblical text, but as a body of knowledge, with its own internal coherence and its own claims about the nature of reality that deserve to be taken seriously on their own terms. The tablets that contain the 7 warnings, or at least the textual material from which the 7 warnings have been reconstructed by modern researchers, came from this same wave of excavation. They were among the tens of thousands of tablets that archaeologists pulled from the ruins of Nineveh, Nippur, Ur, Lagash, and other ancient Mesopotamian sites in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of these tablets went directly into museum collections where they sat, largely unexamined, for decades. The sheer volume of material was overwhelming. The British Museum alone acquired hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets, and the process of examining, cataloging, photographing, and translating them has been going on for over a century and is still far from complete. It is quite possible that significant material related to the 7 warnings has not yet been properly examined, that the full content of what the Sumerian scribes preserved is still waiting in museum archives, not yet read by anyone in the modern world. This is one of the reasons that the 7 warnings, as presented in the work of modern researchers, should be understood as a partial reconstruction rather than a complete text. The researchers who have identified and analyzed the warnings have done so by cross-referencing material from multiple tablet series, Using comparative linguistic analysis to identify thematic connections across texts that may not have been physically proximate, and applying interpretive frameworks that combine mainstream Assyriology with the alternative frameworks developed by researchers like Sitchin and others who work in the ancient astronaut tradition. The result is a picture of the warnings that is compelling in its coherence and precision, but that should not be mistaken for a complete and definitive translation of a single unified document. The 7 warnings are a reconstruction, an extraction from a larger body of material, a synthesis that reflects both the genuine knowledge embedded in the original texts and the interpretive choices of the modern researchers who have worked with them. This does not undermine their significance, it contextualizes it. The knowledge they contain is real knowledge, drawn from real texts produced by a real civilization with genuine astronomical and cosmological sophistication. The specific framing of that knowledge as 7 sequential warnings is the product of modern interpretive work that has organized the available material into the most coherent and useful form. The Sumerian scribes may or may not have thought of their astronomical and cosmological texts as organized around 7 warnings in precisely the way that modern researchers have framed it. What they definitely did do was embed, in their astronomical texts and their cosmological narratives and their wisdom literature, the substantive knowledge that the 7 warnings attempt to convey. The organization is modern, the substance is ancient. With this in mind, let us return to the substantive claims of the warnings and examine them through the lens of the full range of evidence available to us. We have already looked at the astronomical evidence, the physical evidence, and the social evidence for the first 4 warnings. We have discussed the 5th warning's description of institutional inversion in considerable detail. Let us now look at the 6th warning from the perspective of the astronomical evidence that bears on the claim of the return of those who went before. The astronomical signature of the return, as the Sumerian texts describe it, is the appearance of a specific celestial configuration that the scribes associated with the presence of the Anunnaki. This is one of the most controversial and most discussed topics in the entire ancient astronaut literature. Sitchin famously claimed that the Anunnaki came from a planet he called Nibiru, which he identified with the 12th planet of the solar system, an object on a highly elliptical orbit that brings it into the inner solar system on a cycle of approximately 3,600 years. The 6th warning, in Sitchin's reading, is connected to the return of Nibiru to the inner solar system, an event that would be visible as a bright celestial object in the night sky and that would herald the return of the Anunnaki to direct involvement in Earth affairs. Sitchin's identification of Nibiru with a specific planet and his calculation of its orbital period have been criticized by mainstream astronomers. The evidence for a large planetary body on a highly elliptical orbit that brings it through the inner solar system is not supported by modern planetary science. The gravitational perturbations that such a body would produce on the outer planets have not been observed. The thermal signature of such a body, which should be visible to modern infrared telescopes, has not been detected. Sitchin's specific claims about the orbital mechanics of Nibiru are not consistent with what we know about the solar system. But the specific claims of Sitchin's model are not the same thing as the general claim that the 6th warning makes, which is that the correction cycle is connected to the approach of something associated with the Anunnaki. Even if Sitchin was wrong about the specific mechanism, the general structure of the warning, that the correction cycle is connected to a return of some kind, can be evaluated independently of Sitchin's specific model. And when you look at the Sumerian astronomical texts without the overlay of the Nibiru hypothesis, what you find is a more nuanced picture. The Anunnaki are associated in the texts with multiple celestial objects. Anu, the sky itself, the highest of the Anunnaki, is identified with certain configurations of the entire celestial sphere. Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki who presides from Nippur, is associated with a specific region of the sky. Enki, the Anunnaki who is described as the creator of humanity and the most involved with Earth directly, is associated with the southern sky and with several specific celestial objects. The return described in the 6th warning is associated with Anu, with the sky itself, with a configuration of the celestial sphere rather than with the approach of a specific body. This is a very different claim from Sitchin's Nibiru hypothesis. It is saying that the configuration of the visible sky, the arrangement of the planets, the stars, and the moon in a specific pattern is itself the sign of the Anunnaki's return, not the return of a physical body from outside the solar system. The configuration of the existing solar system in a pattern that the Sumerian framework identifies with the Anunnaki's active presence rather than their withdrawal. This is a more conservative claim and a more astronomically tractable one. It is a claim about planetary alignments and celestial configurations, not about the existence of a hypothetical unseen planet. And it is a claim that can be evaluated against the modern astronomical record of the current era's celestial configurations. When you evaluate it against that record, what you find is consistent with the broader pattern we have been examining. The current era is a period of multiple significant planetary configurations, several of which match patterns that the Sumerian astronomical texts associate with the Anunnaki's direct involvement in terrestrial affairs. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle, which the Sumerians tracked as a major indicator of cosmic transitions, is in a phase that the Sumerian framework would identify as associated with change of the highest order. The relationship between these planetary cycles and the lunar nodal cycle is in a configuration that the Sumerian texts describe in terms associated with major transitions in the management system. And the overall configuration of the celestial sphere in the current era matches, in general terms, the description in the sixth warning of the pattern that was written before the flood. None of this proves that the Anunnaki are returning. It proves that the celestial configurations that the Sumerians associated with the Anunnaki's presence are currently occurring. Whether that correspondence is meaningful, whether it tells us anything real about the state of the cosmic management system, depends on whether you accept the Sumerian framework's claim that these celestial configurations are significant indicators, rather than random patterns in an indifferent sky. That is a question that the available evidence cannot definitively answer. But it is a question that deserves to be asked with intellectual seriousness rather than reflexive dismissal. The return that the sixth warning describes may be more about the return of a certain quality of cosmic attention than about the return of physical beings. The correction cycle, in the Sumerian framework, is itself a form of Anunnaki involvement. The management system that the Anunnaki installed does not require their direct physical presence to operate. It is, in a sense, their extended presence. It runs according to parameters they established, on cycles they designed, producing corrections that they built into the system's operating logic. In this framework, the correction cycle is itself the return of those who went before, not as physical entities appearing in the sky, but as the activation of the management protocols they left behind, the system doing what it was designed to do, the maintenance cycle engaging on its scheduled interval. This is a less dramatic version of the sixth warning than the one that populates the ancient astronaut literature, but it may be the more accurate one. And it has the significant advantage of being consistent with what we actually observe in the current era, which is not the appearance of new objects in the sky, but the engagement of patterns and dynamics that were written into the system long before any currently living human was born. There is another dimension of the Sumerian lunar warnings that most researchers, even those working in the alternative tradition, have not fully explored. The connection between the moon's role in the Anunnaki management system and the specific physical properties of the moon that make it suitable for that role. Because the moon's fitness as a component of a cosmic management system is not simply asserted in the Sumerian texts. It is, in a sense, demonstrated by the moon's actual properties. Properties that the modern scientific investigation of the moon has confirmed, at least in their outline. The moon is exactly the right size to produce total solar eclipses, as seen from Earth. This is a property that no other moon in the solar system has in relation to its host planet. The ratio between the moon's diameter and its distance from Earth and the sun's diameter and its distance from Earth are so close that a total solar eclipse, in which the moon exactly covers the sun's disk and allows the sun's corona to be visible, is possible from Earth. The precision of this match is extraordinary. The moon's angular diameter, as seen from Earth, averages approximately half a degree. The sun's angular diameter, as seen from Earth, also averages approximately half a degree. The match is not perfect, which is why we have both total and annular solar eclipses depending on where the moon is in its slightly elliptical orbit. But it is close enough to produce the phenomenon of totality, which is unlike anything else that any planet in the solar system experiences. This property of the Earth-Moon system, the perfect eclipse property, is either a remarkable coincidence or it is not a coincidence. Mainstream scientists generally treat it as a coincidence, noting that the match is not absolutely precise and will not be maintained indefinitely since the moon is slowly receding from Earth and will eventually be too small to produce total eclipses at all. But the coincidence interpretation faces a difficulty. The probability of this match occurring randomly, given the range of sizes and distances that moons and parent bodies can have in a solar system, is quite low. Not impossibly low, given the large number of solar systems in the universe, but low enough that it is reasonable to ask whether the match is in fact a coincidence. And the Sumerian framework provides a different answer. The match is not a coincidence because the moon's placement was deliberate. The moon was placed where it is specifically because its position at that distance from Earth produces the total eclipse phenomenon. which is itself a functionally significant property for a component of a management system. A signal capability. A visibility event that draws the attention of observers on the ground to the moon's relationship with the sun at the moments when that relationship is most precisely aligned. This is speculative. It cannot be proven, but it is consistent with the pattern we have been examining throughout this discussion. The moon has properties that seem specifically suited to its role as a component of a management system. The total eclipse property is 1. The tidal influence on water systems that correlates with specific orbital configurations is another. The seismic behavior that suggests an interior structure different from what natural formation processes would produce is a third. Each of these properties, taken individually, can be accommodated within mainstream scientific models, though often with some difficulty. Taken together, they form a picture of a moon that is doing more than a randomly formed natural satellite would be expected to do. The Sumerian scribes knew about total solar eclipses. They tracked them carefully. The eclipse records in the astronomical tablets are among the most precise of all Sumerian astronomical observations. And they treated eclipses not as random celestial events, but as significant communications within the cosmic management system. Solar eclipses, in the Sumerian framework, were moments of maximum cosmic signaling. Moments when the moon's relationship to the sun was most precisely aligned and when the information content of that alignment was most clearly visible. The first warning, about the moon behaving as a mirror rather than a lamp, is connected in some interpretive frameworks to this eclipse signaling capacity. When the moon's behavior in relation to the sun shifts in the ways that precede and follow major correction cycles, that shift is legible to those who know how to read it precisely, because the moon's role as a cosmic signal device is what the first warning is about. The Sumerian concept of the moon as a signal device, as a component of a communication system rather than simply a gravitational and illuminating presence in the sky, is one of the most interesting and most underexamined aspects of the whole seven-warning framework. In modern information theory, a signal device is distinguished from background noise by the fact that its variations carry meaningful content. Random variations do not carry information. Structured variations do. The moon's variations in brightness, in apparent size, in color, in position relative to the fixed stars, in its relationship to the planets, and in its relationship to the sun are all structured variations. They follow patterns, and the Sumerian scribes devoted enormous effort to characterizing those patterns, precisely enough that deviations from the established patterns would be recognizable and interpretable. This is the technical core of the seven warnings. The moon has established patterns of behavior. The Sumerian scribes mapped those patterns with extraordinary precision. The seven warnings describe specific deviations from those established patterns, deviations that the Sumerian framework associates with specific conditions in the larger cosmic and terrestrial system. When the moon begins to behave as a mirror rather than a lamp, that is a deviation from its established pattern of illuminating behavior, and it carries specific information about a changed condition in the larger system. When the underground waters begin to move in patterns that do not match the established lunar calendar, that is a deviation from the established pattern of the moon's influence on terrestrial water systems, and it carries specific information about a changed condition in the Earth's physical infrastructure. When the gate of the moon opens at the wrong time, that is a deviation from the established pattern of the moon's nodal cycle, and it carries specific information about a changed condition in the cosmic management system's operation. All seven warnings are, at their technical core, descriptions of specific, measurable deviations from established patterns. This is what makes them navigational rather than prophetic. Prophecy tells you what will happen regardless of your actions. Navigation tells you where you are. The seven warnings are telling you where you are in the correction cycle by describing the specific deviations from established patterns that you should be able to observe. If you can observe them, you know where you are. If you know where you are, you can act appropriately. The question of whether we can currently observe the deviations described in the warnings has occupied us for much of this exploration. The honest answer is that we can observe conditions that are consistent with the deviations the warnings describe. But we cannot observe the deviations in their original Sumerian technical sense because we do not possess the full Sumerian measurement system against which deviations would be defined. We are working with approximations, with analogs, with conditions that match the general character of the deviations the warnings describe without perfectly matching the specific technical definitions that the Sumerian framework would have used to identify them precisely. This is a genuine limitation. It means that our assessment of whether the warnings are currently active must be held with appropriate uncertainty. We can say that the conditions we observe are consistent with what the warnings describe. We cannot say with certainty that the specific deviations the warnings were designed to identify are currently occurring, because we do not have the full technical framework needed to make that identification with the precision the Sumerian scribes intended. But this limitation cuts both ways. It means we cannot be certain that the warnings are active. It also means we cannot be certain that they are not. And given the consistency of multiple independent lines of evidence with the general pattern the warnings describe, the most intellectually honest position is one of serious attention combined with epistemic humility. We are in a period that is consistent with the conditions the warnings describe. We should take that seriously. We should not treat it as proven. We should pay attention, continue gathering evidence, maintain the awareness that the warnings call for, and act with the care and intentionality that the navigational framework they provide suggests. This is, in a sense, the appropriate relationship to have with any body of ancient knowledge that claims to be predictively accurate. Ancient knowledge systems have a mixed track record when it comes to predictive accuracy in the modern sense. Some specific predictions embedded in ancient astronomical traditions have turned out to be accurate. Many have not. The error rate is high enough that blanket credulity is not warranted. But the signal rate is high enough, especially in the Sumerian astronomical tradition, where the precision of the mainstream records is independently verifiable, that blanket dismissal is not warranted either. The appropriate position is one of critical engagement. Take the claims seriously enough to investigate them rigorously. Hold the conclusions with appropriate uncertainty. Act on what the evidence supports without acting on what it does not. In the case of the 7 warnings, the evidence supports taking the warnings seriously as a navigational framework for understanding the current era of transition that we are living through. The specific astronomical claims can be partially verified through modern research. The physical claims about underground water systems and lunar optical behavior are consistent with modern observational data. The social claims about institutional inversion match current observable reality with uncomfortable precision. And the overall structure of the warnings, the cascade from astronomical through physical through social to the event itself, and through the aftermath to the possibility of the 7th warning, provides a coherent framework for understanding what is happening that is more illuminating, not less, than the conventional frameworks that mainstream discourse typically offers. This is the most important practical takeaway from the entire 7 warning framework. Not the specific predictions about water systems or celestial alignments, though those are interesting and worth tracking. The most practically useful element of the framework is its insistence that the current moment is not random chaos. It is a structured process. It follows a known pattern. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it has a purpose, even if that purpose is not the purpose that any individual human being would have chosen, and even if navigating it involves genuine difficulty and loss. The correction cycle is purposeful. And people who understand its purpose are better positioned to navigate it than people who experience it as random catastrophe. This is what the Sumerian scribes were trying to give the people who would one day read their warnings, not false comfort. Not a promise that everything would be all right. A framework, a map, a set of reference points that would allow those in between, those who had enough awareness to recognize that something significant was happening but who did not yet have the full framework to understand what it was, to get their bearings. To know where they were, to understand what stage of the process they were in, to make informed choices about how to navigate it rather than simply being driven by it. The moon stands at the crossing. The 4th warning has begun. We are not approaching the correction cycle, we are in it. The question now is not whether the warnings were right, the question is what we do with that knowledge. In the ancient city of Lagash, which sits today beneath a mound in southern Iraq that archaeologists call Tello, there was a temple complex dedicated to the moon god Nana that was considered one of the most sacred sites in all of Sumerian civilization. The temple was called the House of Great Light, a name that already signals the Sumerian understanding of the moon as more than simply a source of nighttime illumination. The great light that the temple honored was not the raw photons of moonlight. It was the information content of those photons, the knowledge encoded in the moon's behavior, the cosmic intelligence that the moon, in the Sumerian understanding, was the vehicle for. The priests who served in the House of Great Light were not simply ritualists. They were astronomers. They maintained continuous observational records of the moon's behavior. They compared current observations against historical records going back to the earliest period of the Sumerian astronomical tradition. They were responsible for identifying deviations from established patterns and for interpreting those deviations within the cosmological framework that the Anunnaki had transmitted. In a very real sense, the priests of Nana were doing what we would today call monitoring. They were watching the moon as a component of a system and tracking its operational status. The 7 warnings were part of their operational monitoring protocol. They were the specific conditions that the monitoring was designed to identify. The fact that this monitoring function was embedded in a religious institution is significant, but not in the way that modern secular thinking typically assumes. Modern thinking tends to assume that when something is embedded in a religious institution, it is being treated as non-rational, as beyond the domain of evidence and reason, as a matter of faith rather than observation. The Sumerian temple tradition challenges this assumption. The House of Great Light was simultaneously a religious institution and a scientific research program. The rituals it conducted were simultaneously devotional acts and observational methodologies. The theology it expressed was simultaneously a statement of cosmological belief and a technical framework for understanding how the cosmos works. The separation between religion and science that modern thinking assumes was not present in the Sumerian worldview. The moon was simultaneously a god and an astronomical object and a component of a management system. All three of these descriptions were considered simultaneously true and mutually compatible. This integrated understanding of the moon is one of the things that makes the Sumerian framework so difficult to properly evaluate from a modern standpoint. We tend to read the Sumerian texts through one lens or another. The mainstream reads them through the religious lens and sees mythology. The alternative tradition tends to read them through the technical lens and sees literal descriptions of technology. Both of these readings capture something real. Neither captures the full picture. The full picture is a tradition that did not separate the sacred from the technical, that understood the cosmic management system as simultaneously divine and mechanical, that saw the moon as simultaneously a god and a machine, and as something that the distinction between God and machine does not adequately describe. To fully appreciate the 7 warnings, you have to hold this integrated view. The warnings are not primarily religious prophecy. They are not primarily technical documentation. They are both simultaneously. They are the product of a civilization that understood the cosmos as a designed and managed system, that understood the design as the work of beings whose nature exceeded human understanding in some dimensions while being practically continuous with human nature in others, and that understood their own role as participants in a cosmic project, rather than as isolated beings in an indifferent universe. The 7 warnings reflect this understanding. They are written from within a framework that takes seriously both the technical mechanics of the moon's behavior and the purposeful intelligence behind those mechanics. And they are addressed to whoever is reading them from within the same integrated framework. This is why the warnings have survived. Not because they were particularly dramatic or entertaining, though they are both of those things in their way. They survived because they were considered genuinely important by every generation of scribes that had access to them. They were copied and preserved and passed on, because the tradition that produced them understood that the knowledge they contained was of the kind that needed to survive across very long periods of time. The kind of knowledge that might not be needed for centuries or millennia at a stretch, but that would be critically needed when the cycle aligned correctly. The kind of knowledge that you do not preserve because it is currently useful. You preserve it because it will be useful when the time comes. And you trust that the time will come, because the cycles that make it useful are built into the system. The scribes of ancient Mesopotamia who copied and recopied and transmitted these tablets were not preserving curiosities. They were performing a function within the larger system, a maintenance function, keeping the knowledge alive so that when it was needed, it would be there. In this sense, the scribes themselves were part of the management system, not as Anunnaki, not as cosmic beings, as human participants in a cosmic project that assigned them a specific role, the role of the keeper of the tablets. The role described in the dialogue between the Great One and the keeper of the tablets, the dialogue in which the Great One asks whether the 7 warnings are properly preserved and the keeper confirms that they are. The scribes who performed that function were fulfilling the 7th warning's promise. They were the evidence that the door was open. They were the people in between who had found the knowledge and preserved it, who had walked through the door and brought something back from the other side for those who would need it later. We are now those who need it later. And what the warnings tell us about this specific moment is worth stating as clearly as possible before we move into the final section of this exploration. The 4th warning has begun. The correction cycle is active. We are in a period of structured disruption, not random chaos. The disruption follows a known pattern that the Sumerian scribes mapped with their characteristic precision. And embedded within the disruption, as the 7th warning tells us, is a door, an opening. An access to knowledge and connection and understanding that the old ordering had suppressed and that the correction cycle is now revealing. To find the door, you have to be willing to look. And looking means being willing to take seriously the framework that the Sumerian warnings provide without either accepting it uncritically or dismissing it defensively. It means paying attention to the moon, to the water systems, to the institutions, to the celestial configurations, and to the pattern that connects all of these. Not because tracking these things will give you control over the correction cycle. It will not. The correction cycle is not controllable at the individual or even collective human level. But tracking them will give you something more valuable than control. It will give you understanding. And understanding is the most powerful thing that the seventh warning makes available. Understanding of where you are in the process allows you to calibrate your responses appropriately. The person who does not understand that they are in a correction cycle will likely respond to the disruptions of the fifth and sixth warnings with either panic or with increasingly desperate attempts to restore the old ordering. Neither response is helpful. Panic produces destructive behavior that accelerates the worst aspects of the disruption. Attempts to restore the old ordering are not only futile but actively counterproductive. Because the old ordering is precisely what the correction cycle is correcting. What has drifted too far from the parameters. What needs to return toward its designed function, rather than being patched and propped up in its distorted current form. The person who does understand that they are in a correction cycle can approach the disruptions differently. Not with calm indifference, because the disruptions are real, and their consequences for real human lives are serious, but with a quality of orientation that makes it possible to navigate them with intention. To distinguish between what is being lost that genuinely needs to be lost, the inverted institutions, the accumulated drift, the false orderings, and what is being endangered that genuinely needs to be preserved, the fundamental human knowledge, the real community, the essential capacities of civilization, to act to preserve what genuinely needs preserving without clinging to what genuinely needs to change. This is a demanding kind of wisdom. It is the wisdom that the Sumerian framework was designed to cultivate. And it is worth noting that the framework itself, not just its content but its form, is an example of what it advocates. The Sumerian scribes did exactly what they were prescribing for those who would one day need their warnings. They identified what was essential and preserved it. They released attachment to the specific form of their civilization, knowing that the correction cycle would eventually transform it beyond recognition, and instead focused their energy on the knowledge that would survive the transformation and be needed on the other side. The tablets they pressed their warnings into are the most important thing they left behind. Not their palaces, not their administrative records, not their infrastructure. The knowledge. That is what they preserved, and they were right. We are at a similar decision point. What do we preserve? What do we inscribe into the clay that will survive our own correction cycle and find those who will need it on the other side? The seventh warning's promise is that this question can be answered intelligently by those who understand where they are, by those who have walked through the door, by those in between who found the knowledge and used it not for personal advantage but for the purpose it was always intended for. The ongoing maintenance of the human civilization project through the correction cycles that the cosmic management system builds into its schedule. The moon continues to move in its orbit. It has done so for longer than human memory can contain. It will do so for longer than human imagination can project. But in this specific period, in this specific alignment of cycles, the moon stands at the crossing that the fourth warning describes. The configuration written before the flood has been achieved. The correction cycle is engaged, and the door that the seventh warning promises is open. What you do with that knowledge is, ultimately, the only question that matters. The Sumerians did their part. They mapped the pattern. They pressed the warnings into clay. They trusted the tablets to survive. They were right to trust. The tablets survived. The knowledge survived. The warnings arrived. Now they are yours. There is a question that haunts anyone who spends significant time with the Sumerian texts on the moon and the Anunnaki. The question is not primarily about whether the Anunnaki were real, though that question is important. The question is about why the knowledge was embedded so carefully, so redundantly, so deliberately into so many different layers of the textual tradition. Why the astronomical observations and the cosmological framework and the ritual instructions and the narrative literature all converge on the same underlying picture of the moon's role in a managed cosmic system. Why a civilization that presumably had many practical concerns related to agriculture and trade and political administration devoted so much of its intellectual and scribal energy to preserving this specific body of knowledge across thousands of years of continuous transmission? The conventional answer is that religion and astronomy were intertwined in ancient cultures in ways that made this kind of preservation natural. The scribes preserved the astronomical texts because they were part of the sacred tradition. The sacred tradition preserved them because they were connected to the divine order that the temples were responsible for maintaining. This is a reasonable answer as far as it goes. but it does not fully account for the specific content of what was preserved. The Sumerian astronomical tradition did not simply preserve general astronomical observation. It preserved very specific information about the moon's role in a systemic framework, about the conditions under which that role would become disrupted, and about what that disruption would mean for terrestrial civilization. This is not the kind of content that gets preserved simply because it is part of a sacred tradition. This is the kind of content that gets preserved because someone specifically decided that it needed to be preserved, because someone understood that there would be a time when it would be critically needed, and because someone was organized and motivated enough to ensure that the transmission would be maintained across an extraordinary length of time. The Sumerian scribal tradition was that organization. But the motivation, the specific decision to preserve this content rather than other content, traces back to the framework itself. The decision was made by people who understood the Anunnaki framework, who believed that the correction cycles were real and would recur, and who therefore understood that the knowledge of how to recognize and navigate correction cycles was the most important knowledge a civilization could possess. They preserved it the same way that you would preserve instructions for operating critical infrastructure. Not because those instructions are interesting or entertaining, because the day will come when someone needs them and does not have them, and the cost of that absence will be catastrophic. This framing of the Sumerian textual tradition as a deliberately constructed long-term knowledge preservation system changes how we should relate to the texts themselves. They are not simply historical documents from an ancient civilization, they are operational documents. They were written to be used, not just understood. They were written for a purpose that extends beyond the civilization that produced them, a purpose that was, in the understanding of those who produced them, cosmic in scope. And the 7 warnings about the moon are the most operationally significant documents within this tradition, because they are the documents that tell you when the operational framework becomes most necessary. They are the alarm system, and the alarm is currently sounding. What does it mean practically for an individual human being living in the 21st century to receive the 7 warnings? What is the specific operational content that the warnings are trying to convey to those who encounter them now, in this moment, inside the correction cycle they describe? This is the question that the 7th warning points toward without fully answering, because the 7th warning, as we have noted, is deliberately general. It points to the door without specifying what is on the other side. But we can extract from the full body of the Sumerian framework some specific guidance about what the people in between are supposed to do with the knowledge the warnings provide. The first piece of guidance is epistemological. It concerns how you relate to information. The correction cycle, in the Sumerian framework, produces a systematic inversion of information quality, the 5th warning's institutional inversion applied specifically to the information environment. During a correction cycle, the channels through which the ordering normally distributes reliable information become corrupted. The scribes, who are supposed to keep accurate records, begin keeping false ones. The priests who are supposed to interpret celestial signs correctly begin misinterpreting them for political purposes. The merchants who are supposed to maintain accurate weights and measures begin falsifying them for profit. In the modern equivalent, the institutions through which citizens receive reliable information about the world begin to produce systematically distorted information. This is the condition the 5th warning describes, and it is the condition we currently observe. In the face of this information inversion, the Sumerian framework prescribes a specific response. Return to direct observation. Do not rely on received interpretation. Go back to the primary sources. In the Sumerian context, this meant going back to direct observation of the sky, to the primary astronomical records, to the actual text of the tablets, rather than the authorized interpretation provided by whatever priests were currently in power. In the modern context, it means developing the capacity to examine primary sources directly, to cross-reference multiple independent sources, to distinguish between what is actually documented and what is interpretation, and to trust direct observation over mediated interpretation when the two conflict. This is harder than it sounds. We live in an information environment of extraordinary complexity, and the volume of information available to any individual far exceeds what any individual can directly verify. The skill of navigating this environment without being captured by the systematic distortions it contains is one of the most important skills that the correction cycle demands of those who want to navigate it intelligently. The Sumerian scribes who preserved the astronomical records were performing exactly this skill at a civilizational scale. They were going back to the primary observations, to the actual measurements, to the records that could not be falsified without leaving detectable inconsistencies. And they were preserving those primary records against the possibility that the interpretive overlay provided by any particular era's official theology would distort them beyond recognition. They were creating a resource that future people could use to get back to the real information, even if every official channel of their own time was compromised. The second piece of practical guidance from the Sumerian framework concerns community. The flood survivor Utnapishtim was not alone. The preservation of civilization through a correction cycle was, in the Sumerian account, a collective enterprise. It required not just one wise individual who understood what was happening, but a small group of people who shared that understanding and who worked together to preserve what was essential. The Sumerian texts do not romanticize this. They do not describe Utnapishtim as having a perfectly harmonious community around him. They describe him as having done what needed to be done with the people who were available and willing. The preservation was imperfect, but it was sufficient. The essential knowledge survived. The seeds survived. The skills survived. The human capacity to rebuild civilization survived, and that was enough. The practical implication for those living in the current correction cycle is similar. Find the people who share your awareness of what is happening. Not necessarily people who use the same framework or the same vocabulary. People who demonstrate, through their behavior and their choices, that they understand that something significant is underway and that they are responding to it with intention rather than with denial or panic or opportunism. Build genuine community with those people. Not online community, though that has its uses. Physical community, local community. Community organized around the preservation of genuine knowledge and genuine skills and genuine human connection. The correction cycle disrupts large-scale organization. It disrupts the institutions and systems through which modern civilization maintains its complex interdependencies. What it cannot easily disrupt is small-scale, genuine community. The people in your immediate vicinity who share genuine care for each other and genuine competence in the skills that actually sustain life. This is what Utnapishtim built. This is what survived. The third piece of practical guidance is about knowledge itself. What specific knowledge is most worth preserving through a correction cycle? The Sumerian answer is consistent across multiple texts. The knowledge worth preserving is the knowledge of how natural systems work and how human communities can sustain themselves within those systems. Agricultural knowledge, ecological knowledge, the knowledge of plants, animals, soil, water, and weather. The knowledge of construction, of craft, of the basic technologies that allow human communities to clothe, shelter, and feed themselves without depending on complex supply chains or centralized infrastructure. The knowledge of medicine, of healing, of maintaining human health using available natural materials. And the knowledge of community organization, of the social technologies that allow groups of people to make decisions together, resolve conflicts, distribute resources fairly, and maintain cohesion through difficult periods. None of this is exotic knowledge. Much of it is knowledge that was common among ordinary people in most human societies until very recently, and that has been progressively displaced by the industrial specialization of the last 2 centuries. The displacement of this knowledge by industrial specialization is itself part of the drift that the correction cycle addresses. Civilizations that concentrate knowledge in highly specialized institutions lose the distributed resilience that characterizes stable societies. The correction cycle, by disrupting the concentrated institutional structures, simultaneously creates the crisis of lost knowledge and the opportunity to recover it. The 7th warnings door opens onto the possibility of recovering and distributing the fundamental human knowledge that the old ordering had concentrated and sequestered. There is a 4th piece of practical guidance that the Sumerian framework provides, and it is the one most directly connected to the moon and to the astronomical dimension of the warnings. The Sumerians advised careful, regular attention to the sky, not casual glancing, not the occasional awareness of the moon's phase that most modern people maintain. Serious, regular observation of the moon's behavior, its color, its position relative to the stars and planets, its orbital characteristics as they can be observed with the naked eye, and its relationship to terrestrial events over extended time periods. The Sumerians believed that the moon was a source of ongoing information about the state of the cosmic management system, and that regular, careful observation of the moon was one of the ways in which people could maintain their orientation within the correction cycle. This advice is not impractical for a modern person. The moon is visible to anyone with clear skies and a willingness to look. Its phase is trackable with simple observation. Its position in relation to the background stars and planets can be tracked with the naked eye. Its color varies in ways that are observable without instruments. And the relationship between the moon's behavior and terrestrial events, including weather patterns, plant and animal behavior, and even human physiological and psychological states, is something that careful observation over extended time periods can document. Modern science has been somewhat dismissive of lunar influences on terrestrial life beyond the well-documented tidal effects, but this dismissiveness is partly the result of research programs that were not designed to detect the subtler and longer-period influences that the Sumerian framework emphasizes. Individual observation over extended time periods, with careful record-keeping, is actually well-suited to detecting exactly the kinds of influences that population-level statistical analyses are not designed to find. The Sumerians were doing this kind of observation over periods that spanned multiple human lifetimes, maintaining continuous records that allowed subtle patterns to become visible against the background of longer cycles. This is the kind of observation that the first warning calls for, not a one-time check of the moon's color. A sustained practice of attention, maintained across years, that builds the pattern recognition needed to identify genuine deviations from the established baseline. The scribes of the House of Great Light in Lagash were doing this. The astronomer priests of Nippur were doing this. They were maintaining a practice of sustained lunar observation that kept them continuously informed about the state of the system they were monitoring. The 7 warnings were the product of that sustained practice. And the practical prescription they embed for those living in a correction cycle includes maintaining, to whatever extent is possible, some version of that practice. This brings us to a dimension of the 7 warnings that we have not yet fully explored. The psychological dimension. What does it do to a person, to a community, to know that they are living inside a correction cycle? To know that the disruptions they are experiencing are not random, but purposeful? That the institutions failing around them are failing in a specific pattern that follows a known sequence? That the physical world is changing in ways that are connected to astronomical cycles that were mapped thousands of years ago? That the knowledge they need to navigate this moment is available, in the warnings and in the larger tradition that produced them? What does it do to people to have this knowledge rather than not having it? The Sumerian scribes seem to have believed that it does something specific and important. It makes the difference between experiencing the correction cycle as catastrophe and experiencing it as passage. A catastrophe is something that happens to you, something you did not see coming and cannot understand, something that can only be endured or succumbed to. A passage is something you are moving through, something you can navigate with intention, something you can come out of on the other side, still carrying what you need to carry. The knowledge of the correction cycle does not make the passage easy, but it makes it possible. It transforms catastrophe into passage. It provides the orientation that allows a human being to maintain their agency within a process that is, in its larger dimensions, beyond individual human control. This is the most fundamental thing the 7 warnings offer. Not specific predictions about celestial alignments or water systems or institutional behavior, though those are part of the package. Not a prescription for surviving the correction cycle, though the practical guidance embedded in the framework is genuinely useful. What the warnings offer, at the deepest level, is a context, a meaning, an understanding of the correction cycle that situates it within a larger story. A story in which human civilization is not simply buffeted by random forces, but is part of a project, a managed project, with a purpose, operating within systems that were designed with intention, and that cycle through correction periods as a normal part of their operation. In that context, the correction cycle is not a punishment or a disaster. It is a scheduled maintenance event. It is the system doing what it was designed to do, and those who understand that are not victims of it. They are participants in it. This is the gift of the 7th warning, not the specific opportunity it describes, though that opportunity is real. The gift is the transformation of your relationship to what is happening, the transformation from recipient of catastrophe to participant in passage, the transformation from person to whom history is happening to person who is part of history's larger pattern, the transformation from someone who needs the disruption to stop to someone who can work within the disruption toward what comes after it. The Sumerians believed this transformation was possible. They believed it enough to build an entire civilizational knowledge preservation project around it. They pressed their warnings into clay, and they trusted that those warnings would find the people who needed them, that the tablets would survive, that the knowledge would be recovered, that those in between would find it and use it. And they were right. The tablets survived. The knowledge was recovered. You are one of those in between. You have found it. The moon stands at the crossing. The 4th warning has begun. The door is open. Walk through it. Before we reach the final synthesis, there is one more body of evidence that deserves careful attention. The physical evidence for the moon's anomalous properties is not simply a matter of the hollow-ringing seismic data from the Apollo missions, though that data is striking enough on its own. The full picture of the moon's physical anomalies is more extensive than most people who have not researched this specifically are aware. and it has implications for the Sumerian framework that are worth drawing out explicitly. The moon's density is lower than you would expect for a rocky body of its size. The average density of the moon is approximately 3.3 grams per cubic centimeter. The average density of the Earth is approximately 5.5 grams per cubic centimeter. This density difference is understood in the context of the giant impact hypothesis as reflecting the moon's formation primarily from the Earth's mantle material, which is less dense than the iron-nickel core that makes up a significant fraction of the Earth's total mass. The moon, in this model, has very little core because the material that formed it came mostly from the mantle. This explanation is internally consistent. But the moon's density is still lower than you would expect, even from pure mantle material, suggesting that either the mantle material that formed the moon was less dense than typical, or that the moon's interior contains voids or lower density regions that bring its average density down. The seismic data from the Apollo missions bears on this question in an interesting way. The moon is not simply hollow in the science fiction sense of being an empty shell. The seismic data indicates a complex interior structure that is different from what straightforward impact hypothesis models predict. The deep interior of the moon shows very little seismic activity compared to a body of its size and type that has been cooling from its formation state over 4.5 billion years. The moon should be significantly more seismically active than it is, based on what we understand about the cooling and differentiation of rocky bodies in the solar system. The fact that it is less active than expected is another anomaly that the standard model has difficulty accommodating. The concentration of mare basalts, the dark volcanic rock that fills the lunar maria on the near side of the moon, is another anomaly. The far side of the moon has much thicker crust than the near side, and the asymmetry between the near and far sides is greater than impact hypothesis models naturally predict. This near side and far side asymmetry was discovered only after the era of lunar exploration because it requires observations from lunar orbit to characterize, and its causes are still not fully understood. Several competing hypotheses have been proposed, but none is fully satisfying. The ancient lunar swirls, enigmatic light-colored patterns on the lunar surface that are associated with local magnetic anomalies, are another set of observations that resist straightforward explanation within the standard model. The swirls occur at specific locations that correlate with the strongest local magnetic anomalies on the moon's surface. But the origin of these magnetic anomalies is not well understood. They are too strong and too localized to be explained by the standard mechanisms for producing magnetic signatures in a body without a global magnetic field. Some researchers have suggested that the swirls were produced by cometary impacts that magnetize the surface material. Others have proposed that they are associated with some kind of internal magnetic activity that has not been fully characterized. None of the proposed explanations is fully satisfying. Taken individually, each of these anomalies can be accommodated within the standard model with appropriate assumptions and parameters. Taken together, they paint a picture of a moon that is less fully explained by the standard model than the general scientific consensus sometimes implies. The standard model is the best current model. It is based on real evidence, but it is not a perfect model. It has gaps, it has anomalies, it has places where the data and the model do not fit comfortably, where researchers make assumptions or leave questions open rather than claiming that the picture is complete. The Sumerian framework is not a scientific model. It cannot be evaluated by the same criteria as a scientific model, but it can be evaluated by the criterion of consistency with observable evidence. And the Sumerian description of the moon as a constructed or at least managed component of a cosmic management system is at least as consistent with the moon's observed anomalies as the standard giant impact hypothesis is with those same anomalies. Both models have things they explain well and things they have difficulty with. The Sumerian model has the advantage of being internally consistent with a very large body of cosmological and astronomical knowledge, all of which points in the same direction, toward the moon, as a purposeful component of a design system. The standard model has the advantage of being consistent with modern physics and with the independent evidence for impact processes in the solar system. Neither model can be definitively proven or disproven at the current state of knowledge. This scientific agnosticism does not mean that all models are equally valid. It means that the question is genuinely open in ways that the confident dismissal of the Sumerian framework does not acknowledge. And it means that the 7 warnings, which are embedded in the Sumerian framework's understanding of the moon's purpose, cannot be dismissed simply on the grounds that the moon could not possibly be what the Sumerians described it as. The moon might be exactly what they described. The evidence does not rule it out, and that possibility is significant. What would it mean for our understanding of the moon and of our situation if the Sumerian framework were correct? If the moon is genuinely a managed component of a cosmic management system, deliberately placed at its current orbital distance to produce its specific effects on Earth's tidal systems, its gravitational influences on biological rhythms, its role in providing the stable axial tilt that gives Earth its climate, its capacity as a signal relay, and its function as the instrument of the periodic correction cycles that the 7 warnings describe, what would that mean for humanity? It would mean that we are not alone in the universe in a much more immediate sense than the general concept of the plurality of inhabited worlds implies. It would mean that Earth is a managed world. That the conditions of life here, the specific form that life takes on this planet, including the human form, is not simply the product of random physical processes, but is shaped by intelligent intention. It would mean that the history of human civilization, including its catastrophic moments, its correction cycles, its periods of drift and reset, is not simply the product of human choices and natural processes, but is embedded in a larger management framework that extends beyond the human scale in both space and time. This is a challenging picture. For many people, it is an uncomfortable picture. The modern Western worldview is built on the assumption of human autonomy within an essentially indifferent natural universe. The Sumerian framework challenges both halves of that assumption. The universe is not indifferent, and human autonomy is real but limited, operating within a managed system that has its own purposes and its own schedule. The correction cycles are not the result of human choices. They are built into the system. They happen when the system's management parameters say they should happen. Human behavior can influence how the correction cycle manifests, what specific forms the disruption takes, how severe the losses are, how much of what is genuinely valuable survives. But human behavior cannot prevent the correction cycle from occurring or determine its fundamental timing. That is set by the astronomical cycles that the 4th warning describes. For some people, this recognition is deeply liberating rather than distressing. The burden of believing that everything that is happening is the result of specific human choices, and that if only the right human choices were made, everything could be set right, is genuinely heavy. The recognition that we are in a scheduled maintenance period, that the disruption is purposeful rather than random, that there is a framework within which it makes sense, does not eliminate the difficulty. But it does transform its meaning, and the transformation of meaning changes what is possible within it. The same external circumstances, experienced as random catastrophe or experienced as structured passage, produce different human responses. And the different responses produce, over time, different outcomes. Not in the large-scale dynamics of the correction cycle itself, which operate on timescales and at scales that exceed individual human influence, but in the small-scale dynamics of how specific human communities navigate the correction, what knowledge they preserve, what connections they maintain, what they contribute to the new ordering that emerges on the other side. The moon is not simply a rock in the sky. This much, at least, the Sumerian framework establishes with the force of thousands of years of careful observation and sophisticated interpretation. The moon is the most intimately significant celestial body in human experience. Its influence on terrestrial life is documented across multiple domains of modern science. Its role in stabilizing Earth's climate and enabling the specific conditions for complex life is recognized even in the mainstream scientific framework. The question the Sumerian framework adds is whether this influence is passive or designed. Whether the moon is doing what it does because it randomly ended up in a position where those effects happen to follow from its physical properties and orbital location, or whether the moon is doing what it does because it was placed where it is, specifically to produce those effects. The evidence does not definitively answer this question, but the question is the right question, and the 7 warnings are embedded in it. The connection between the moon's physical properties, its role in the cosmic management system as the Sumerians understood it, and the specific conditions described in the 7 warnings is not accidental. It is structural. The warnings are warnings about the moon's behavior because the moon's behavior is where the relevant information is encoded. The first warning watches the moon's light because the moon's light is the earliest available signal of changes in the larger cosmic environment. The second warning watches the underground waters because the moon's gravitational influence on those waters makes them a reliable secondary indicator of the same changes. The third warning watches the lunar node cycle because the node cycle is where the moon's relationship to the larger orbital structure of the solar system is most precisely legible. The fourth warning watches the convergence of multiple long cycles, because that convergence is the highest resolution indicator of where we are in the management system's maintenance schedule. The 5th through 7th warnings shift from astronomical observation to terrestrial consequence and finally to individual possibility, but they remain connected to the astronomical framework that the earlier warnings established. The seventh warning's door is identified as being inside the correction cycle, precisely because the correction cycle is itself defined by the astronomical observations of the earlier warnings. The door is there because the crossing of the moon at the specific configuration of the fourth warning has occurred. The crossing is the context that makes the door possible, and the door is what the whole thing was for. The Sumerians built the most sophisticated knowledge preservation system that any ancient civilization produced. They embedded their most important knowledge in multiple formats, in multiple text types, in multiple institutional contexts, specifically to ensure that it would survive whatever happened to any particular format or institution. The seven warnings are the product of this system, extracted from a much larger body of knowledge and presented here in a synthesized form that sacrifices some of the precision of the original for the accessibility required by those who encounter it outside the full Sumerian context. But even in this synthesized form, the essential content is present. The framework is coherent, the structure is clear. The sequence of conditions and consequences is laid out in a way that allows someone encountering it for the first time to understand where it is pointing and why. We live at a remarkable intersection. We live at the crossing that the fourth warning describes. We live at a moment of multi-cycle convergence that the Sumerian astronomical framework identifies as the trigger point for the correction cycle. We live in a period in which the conditions described in the other warnings are currently observable in forms that are consistent with what those warnings describe. And we live at a moment when the tablets themselves, the preserved knowledge, the synthesized warnings, are accessible in ways that they have not been for thousands of years. The combination of these facts is what the seventh warning was pointing toward. Not a specific individual or a specific group, not a specific culture or a specific place. This moment, this intersection. This extraordinary convergence of the astronomical cycle reaching its critical phase at the same time as the preserved knowledge reaching a new audience capable of engaging with it. The scribes of ancient Nippur were doing their part. The tablets did their part. The modern researchers who excavated and translated and studied and synthesized the material did their part. The knowledge arrived. Now it is yours. And what you do with it, how you receive it, how you integrate it into your understanding of the world you are living in, how you use it to navigate what is coming and what is already here, that is the thing the seventh warning was pointing toward from the beginning. That is the door. That is what is on the other side. The moon tonight, if you step outside and look, is exactly what it has always been. The same moon that the priests of Lagash observed from the ziggurat of the House of Great Light. The same moon that Utnapishtim watched from the deck of his vessel as the waters rose. The same moon that the scribes of Nippur tracked night after night, season after season, century after century, building the observational record that eventually became the seven warnings. It is unchanged. It is doing what it has always done. It is the world below the moon that is in transition. That is always in transition. That cycles through its corrections and rebuildings on the schedule that the larger system determines. And the moon, from its unchanging orbit, reflects the light of the sun down onto all of it, illuminating sometimes, revealing sometimes, signaling always. For those who know how to read the signal, for those who have the framework the Sumerians worked so hard to preserve, for those in between, to whom the tablets were always addressed.